If you are carrying this tale in your pocket as you go about your day, let it be a small instruction manual for living. Bear witness, speak truthfully, be willing to intercede for others, and do it without expectation of applause. Enoch's quiet heroism was the courage to be steady in the face of bewildering choices and to trust that small, faithful actions accumulate into real change. That is the lesson the angels brought to him and the lesson he, in turn, carried into the court. It is a lesson available to anyone who is willing to listen and to plead for a world more gentle than it otherwise might be. If Enoch's quiet courage spoke to you, subscribe and tell us in the comments what moves you more, the strength to stay kind when the world is harsh or the faith to keep doing good when nobody's watching. He came before the throne like a ship entering a harbor that had been carved from light itself, the keel of his life smoothed by years of walking among ordinary people. There is no hurriedness here, only a paced reverence, as though each step were a measured answer to a question that had been waiting since the first dawn. Even in this place beyond measure, his humanity remained tangible, the memory of a child's laugh, the ache of a friend's loss, the smell of the earth after rain. Those small, human particulars were the threads he carried into a realm of blazing symmetry, where compassion found its shape in the geometry of mercy. The throne is not simply a seat, it is a center, a focus of gravity that draws the fullness of things toward it, and yet it does not consume. Around it, light wears form like a cloak, changing hue and texture as if to acknowledge every word spoken in its presence. Sound behaves differently here, folding into itself and bursting into harmonies that do not rely on human ears to be heard. Enoch learned early that to be before the throne was an education in silence and song at once. He stood not as a judge but as an intercessor, a mediator whose daily work was to translate the language of longing. People below called out with names and half-formed requests, with cries that were sometimes jagged and sometimes polished with prayer. Enoch gathered those cries with both hands, turning them into something intelligible to the divine ear without losing their rawness. It was a delicate work, to preserve human particularity while presenting it in a manner that could be received in the realm where everything speaks in archetypes and absolutes. Interceding means more than carrying words, it requires comprehension. Enoch listened for the motives behind prayers, for the small, hidden reasons that shaped each plea. Some petitions were gilded with pride, others wrapped in shame, some were brazen with demand, and some were whispers of trust. To offer these effectively before the throne, he had to see past their surface and arrange them as a book might be arranged, letters into words, words into sentences, sentences into a case that could be weighed. There is a rhythm to this court, a cadence made of patience and inevitability. Before Enoch approaches, the air itself seems to exhale, as though creation holds its breath for a moment. He does not hurry. Haste is a foreign thing in a realm where eternity is not an absence of time but the fullness of it. When he reaches the brink of the throne, he bows in a manner that is not mere deference but a recognition of fit and order, the acknowledgement that some things are rightly ordered by another's wisdom. Angels gather, each like a facet in a great jewel, reflecting an aspect of purpose and will. They are not identical copies but expressions of function, messengers, guardians, keepers of the archives, singers who make the air crystalline with praise. Enoch moves among them with a familiarity born of shared service, sometimes offering a word, sometimes remaining quiet. Angels recognize him as one who once belonged wholly to the earth and now bridges two domains. They treat him with a warmth that is partly camaraderie and partly deferential awe. The throne exudes not heat but an impression of centeredness, as if every argument and every longing in the cosmos eventually slides toward it and is reconciled. Around it there are wheels of light that seem to turn not mechanically but logically, the motion of ideas finding their conclusions. From the throne comes an authority that is not coercive so much as clarifying, it renders meaning. Enoch had learned to trust this order, even in moments when mercy seemed to demand a different outcome than judgment. He understood, intimately, that intercession is a form of bearing witness. To stand in the way is to assert that certain lives matter and that certain choices have consequences beyond the immediate. Enoch bore witness to the struggles of people who could not name their own needs, those whose pain was lodged under layers of forgetfulness and self-protection. He took their anonymity and gave it identity before the throne, gently insisting that God acknowledge what humanity too often dismissed. There were days when Enoch felt the weight of sorrow more than the warmth of praise. He would arrive with petitions that seemed to knot rather than untangle, situations where human will had hardened into patterns that seemed nearly irreversible. In those instances his intercession was a slow, patient labor of untying the knotted will, of persuading not through flattery but through clarity. He learned to be robust in hope but honest in assessment, offering to the throne the truth of the human condition along with the plea for change. The method of his approach was simple and precise. He would present a petition as it was, then unfold its context as a storyteller provides background to a listener. Stories appeal to memory and pattern, they allow the abstract to be known through particulars. Enoch found that this combination, fact and story, helped convey to the divine mind the texture of human choices, the small shifts that turn a life toward flourishing or fall. He was not alone in this craft. Other voices rose in the court, voices of angels, of righteous beings, of those whose lives had been marked by faith. Their contributions were valuable, but Enoch's presence had a distinct quality because he retained a memory of mortality. He could enter God's court and say, with the authority of first-hand experience, what it meant to hunger, to grieve, to dream. That memory made his intercession raw and real in a way that was irreplaceable. Once, in a petition that would linger in his memory, a mother sent him the simple request for the fragile health of her child. The words were ordinary, but beneath them lay an ocean of fear and hope. Enoch cradled that request with care, revealing to the throne not only the child's physical fragility but the web of relationships that anchored that child's life, a grandmother's morning psalm, a neighbor's kindness, the child's own small acts of bravery. He knew that healing touches more than a body, it reconnects a knot in the fabric of a community. The throne's hearing is not a matter of volume, it is a matter of honesty. Enoch came to see that honesty applied as much to the one interceding as to the one petitioning. He could not gloss over the blunt realities of sin or pain. To do so would be to betray both the petition and the order of things. So he learned to carry truth like a lantern, illuminating the crooked places without using its light as a weapon. There is an architecture to mercy, and Enoch became familiar with its rooms. Some rooms are for lament, where the sound of weeping is a form of prayer that needs no translation. Others are for confession, where naming wrongs is a necessary clearing of space. Still others are for gratitude, where thanksgiving forms a kind of bridge that reshapes expectation into appreciation. Moving through these rooms, Enoch arranged petitions so that they entered the throne's ear with the right posture and timing. In that court, time is elastic and moral gravity persists. Decisions there send ripples outward into the world, not always in obvious ways. A word spoken gently before the throne might nudge a heart in a child 3 generations later. A merciful ruling might prevent a long cascade of bitterness. Enoch became adept at perceiving these ripples, at seeing how a small reconciliation petitioned in the court could avert a flood of consequences below. Enoch's work required humility and courage in nearly equal measure. Humility because he stood not to command, but to represent. Courage because he often found himself pleading for mercy when justice might demand otherwise. The courage was not brazen, it was the steady bravery of one who keeps faith with the dignity of the human being. His requests were not naive attempts to subvert order but careful entreaties that sought to align justice and compassion. He also learned the painful art of waiting. Not every plea could be granted immediately, and some would be answered in ways that felt mysterious to human minds. Waiting before the throne taught him patience and taught him to hold hope without forcing its quick arrival. He understood that some answers require time to germinate and that sometimes a no or a not yet is an act of love shaped by foresight beyond his sight. There were moments of confusion and mourning, too, times when Enoch felt the ache of the world's brokenness as a personal burden. He would leave the court with his spirit bruised by stories of cruelty and neglect, and he would wander among gardens or along quiet paths, letting the simple rhythms of creation soothe him. In those solitary walks he recovered perspective, that his fatigue was a mark of compassion, and compassion, however painful, was a kind of fidelity. The court had rituals, not of legalism but of symbolic alignment, gestures and lights and tones that oriented the heart. These rituals were no mere theatricality, they were ways of training the senses to receive the divine. When Enoch learned them, he was learning a language of reception, how to quiet inner noise, how to open to a response that might not look like what he expected. Rituals taught him to translate the abstract order of the throne into the concrete choices of daily life. He came to think of his role as a kind of translation office. On one side were the untidy, passionate pleadings of human beings, on the other was a realm of absolutes and everlasting purposes. The task was to convey the human to the divine without robbing it of its humanity, and to convey the divine to the human without diminishing its transcendence. This required subtlety, to know when to press and when to withdraw, when to insist and when to accept restraint. Enoch's memory stretched like a map. He remembered the cities he had walked through, the marketplaces and quiet kitchens, the small acts of kindness that went unnoticed by history yet mattered profoundly to the people who performed them. These memories were not mere nostalgia, they were data points in his petitions. He could, with simple narrative detail, show the throne how a single act of generosity had altered the course of a life and thereby shaped the moral landscape. In the court, names matter. To speak a person's name before the throne is to summon the particularity of their existence, to place them within the web of creation where nothing is anonymous. Enoch protected names like treasures, safeguarding their dignity against abstractions that would sweep them aside. He taught those who served with him to value names, to see them as keys that opened doors of understanding and compassion. He was sometimes asked to carry hard cases, petitions that were entangled with deep harms, betrayals, violence, abuses of power. These were the petitions that tested his mettle, that pushed him to his limits of endurance and imagination. He learned to walk into those dark places with a steady hand, offering both the raw facts and the possibility of rehabilitation. He knew that naming the harm was essential, but naming alone could not do the work of reconciling a wounded person with a wounder. In those situations, his intercession had a procedural feel, first to acknowledge the hurt, then to ask for truth to be known, then to lobby for protection for the vulnerable, and finally to petition for healing. This was not a mechanical script but a disciplined approach born of countless cases. It was also flexible. Sometimes protection came before truth, sometimes reconciliation had to be delayed until safety was assured. Enoch's experience taught him to adapt, to place the well-being of the victim at the center of counsel. There were times when the court itself seemed to ripple with debate, not because the throne was uncertain but because the many aspects of justice and mercy needed to be weighed in careful balance. Enoch participated in these deliberations not as an equal authority but as a witness and advocate. He presented the nuance of human lives against the backdrop of cosmic order, and in doing so he served as a kind of conscience for the court, insisting that compassion be considered alongside law. Enoch's intercession was not only reactive, it was preventative. He could, in some cases, see the dark turning of events and petition to avert them before they took root. Like a gardener tending a fragile sapling, he would suggest interventions that might steer a life away from ruin. These preemptive petitions were subtle acts of foresight, requiring understanding of causes and consequences that were not always visible at ground level. Music threaded the court as a living element. It was not background, it was a language that formed the air into patterns of attention. Sometimes a petition would arrive as a tone, a space opened by sound where the throne's response could be heard. Enoch used music as much as words, shaping requests into melodies that fit the ear of eternity. He learned to hum the right line at the right time, to let melody carry what language could not. There were instruments that seemed to be made of light, and voices that resonated like bells. These were not foreign to Enoch. He had trained his memory to recognize their timbres, to know that certain harmonic structures corresponded with certain kinds of response. He would bring the plaintive strains of a mourner into the court and let a compassionate motif take it up, transforming lament into a promise of restoration. That transformation felt like a kind of alchemy. Enoch's own voice changed in the process of his service. It acquired a tonality that mixed earthiness and clarity, like a river voice that knows both bank and deep. He could speak in the blunt cadences that human ears recognized, and he could modulate into something more crystalline for the throne's ear. That duality made him an especially valuable mediator, able to inhabit both languages without losing authenticity. Stories of his intervention spread among the people he had once walked with, becoming quiet legends, a man who was seen entering the court and emerging with a peace that had not been there before. These stories were not sensational, they were mostly small testimonies of relief and reorientation. People retold them at wells and in market squares as proof that the world could be touched by a justice that heard their names. Despite the solemnity of his office, there was tenderness in Enoch's way. He did not approach his role with sternness alone. He often brought laughter into the court in the small way of someone who appreciates the fragile beauty of human foibles. His laughter was not mockery but an acknowledgement of the comic relief that human life sometimes supplies. Even in the highest places, joy has its proper place, and Enoch knew how to let it soften the edges of burden. The throne does not require flattery, and Enoch was never tempted to offer it. Flattery is always a distortion, and to distort in the presence of truth would be to betray both the throne and those he represented. Instead, he offered frankness seasoned with hope, a combination that often carried the day. Frankness here was not bluntness but clarity, a willingness to name realities without despairing of the possibility of renewal. Enoch's intercession extended beyond individuals to communities and nations. He would sometimes present the condition of a people as a tapestry, noting the interwoven threads of history, economics, memory, and leadership. He did not simplify the complexities. Instead, he emphasized how each thread mattered to the health of the whole. These petitions required a different scale of imagination, one that could hold systemic harms and collective hopes simultaneously. There were seasons when the court seemed to weigh whole epochs, where decisions had ramifications that would unfold across generations. Enoch held fast in those times to the conviction that small acts of mercy, when multiplied, could change trajectories. He argued for the power of incremental transformation, for policies and practices that favored restoration over punishment. Many of his pleas in this arena were not dramatic proclamations but proposals for structural kindness. He also engaged with the paradoxes of justice. When should punishment be retributive and when restorative? How does one balance accountability with the possibility of rehabilitation? These questions required the court to exercise prudence, and Enoch's voice often brought a practical wisdom shaped by his knowledge of human stubbornness and capacity for change. He resisted easy answers and instead cultivated patient discernment. Enoch knew that not every plea could be granted in the way petitioners asked. Sometimes the answer would be rearrangement rather than reversal, healing that took place through the acceptance of loss. In those cases, he became a teacher of solace, helping people understand that wholeness might emerge in forms they had not expected. His pastoral skill lay in naming hope without denying reality. He discovered over time that the act of interceding transformed him as much as it influenced outcomes. With each petition, he felt his own heart stretched and refined. Where once he might have responded with indignation, he grew able to hold anger without letting it harden into cynicism. Where once he might have been tempted to despair at recalcitrant wills, he learned to persist with patience. The throne itself seemed to approve of persistence. It is not that repetition alters moral truth, but repeated petitions reveal the depth of human yearning and the resilience of hope. Enoch learned that to return again and again was not a sign of weakness but of fidelity. Such persistence became a vocation in itself, a quiet, steady drumbeat in the court's life. He was often conscious of the presence of ancient things, scrolls and ledgers that recorded judgments, notes of covenant, and chronicles of mercy. These artifacts were not cold records but living references that informed present decisions. Enoch would consult them in the manner one consults a long-accumulated wisdom, seeing patterns and precedents. He was careful not to reduce the present to precedent, but he valued the continuity of memory. He treated precedent like a compass rather than a chain. It guided but did not bind absolutely. There were moments when the court innovated, crafting remedies that honored both justice and mercy in new ways. Enoch welcomed those moments, recognizing that the moral imagination must be creative to meet novel problems. He sometimes proposed solutions that blended old wisdom with fresh insight. Among the court's inhabitants, the throne respected silence as much as speech. Moments of unspoken acknowledgement were often as potent as any petition. Enoch came to cherish these quiet instants, and in them he felt the presence of a sovereign peace that did not need to be asserted. Silence, he discovered, carried its own form of intercession, an open, receptive posture that trusts in the action of love. He also encountered resistance, not from the throne but from the inertia of certain human choices. Some people refused help, some communities preferred old grievances, some leaders clung to power that corrupted their vision. Enoch learned a painful lesson about the limits of persuasion. One cannot grant willingness where there is none. Yet he never ceased to attempt to awaken conscience, believing that the slow turn of repentance was possible even in hardened hearts. There were nights when he would take petitions into solitude and pray in a manner that felt less like bargaining and more like communion. These times were reforms of spirit, moments when he replenished his own capacity to care. He did not rely solely on official channels. He knew that personal devotion stoked the fires of effective intercession. Those private hours were the deep wells from which his public ministry drew its vitality. Enoch's style was characterized by a persistent attentiveness to detail. To him, the placement of a word, the mention of a memory, the inclusion of a simple act of kindness could make the difference between a petition being heard and understood or being lost in abstraction. He taught those under his care to list particulars, a caregiver's routine, a child's favorite song, the specific pattern of a household's need. These small facts made the human reality palpable before the throne. There was an economy of attention in his work. He could not carry every plea with equal intensity, so he learned to prioritize without becoming judgmental. Some cases demanded immediate focus, others required watching over time. He arranged his attention like a steward manages resources, allocating it prudently and lovingly, knowing that attention itself is a kind of blessing. In partnership with angels, Enoch sometimes devised practical interventions that the world below could enact. He would translate a courtly decision into tangible suggestions, a counsel to convene, a resource to redistribute, a ritual of repentance to be practiced. These were not magical fixes but concrete actions that could redirect momentum. He trusted that divine intent often moves through human agency, and so he invested in the means by which celestial rulings became terrestrial realities. The people who received these interventions were rarely aware of the heavenly negotiations behind their change. To them, a sudden turn of luck or a new opening in an entrenched situation felt like a gift. Enoch took joy in anonymity. He did not seek credit but delight in the flourishing that followed. That humility kept him tethered to the simplest joy of his work, seeing life made healthier and freer. He often reflected on the paradox of power before the throne. The most profound power there is not coercive dominance but the ability to bring about alignment with truth. This power, unlike worldly power, does not crush but clarifies. Enoch's intercession aimed at that kind of alignment, to help wills become harmonized with an order that fosters life rather than diminishes it. There were times when Enoch's petitions were rebuffed, not out of indifference but out of a larger wisdom that required delay. He learned to be patient with refusal and to find meaning in being told no or not now. Sometimes refusal functioned as a protective measure, a hedge against unintended harm that could arise from well-meaning but premature action. Over time, he came to see these refusals as part of a broader pedagogy of wisdom. As centuries passed, Enoch's perspective broadened and deepened. He grew to understand patterns of human history, how empires rise and fall, how moral systems ossify, how mercy can be institutionalized or thwarted. This long view gave him a distinctive advantage in intercession, allowing him to propose remedies that were not merely immediate fixes but long-term nurtures. He could, in a sense, play for generations. Yet he never lost tenderness for the immediate. He treated both the long arc and the small bend with equal concern. To him, a child's healed wound was as significant as a policy changed across a nation. Both mattered because both were part of the same fabric. This integrated concern made his petitions harmonious, neither abstractly utopian nor narrowly pragmatic. He developed an unusual skill of reading the moods of the court. He could sense when a particular strain of mercy was plentiful and when sternness had its season. This perception helped him time his petitions, to speak when receptivity was ripe and to wait when it was not. Timing, he found, often mattered as much as content. A well-timed plea could be more effective than a perfectly worded one. There were instances when the court's response surprised him, offering mercy in forms he had not imagined. Once, a petition for reconciliation resulted not in reconciliation but in mutual transformation. Both parties were reformed by the process. In another case, a request for deliverance arrived as a redirection that led someone into service they had never considered. These outcomes taught Enoch not to confine his expectation to narrow answers. His intercession bridged many divides, with God, with creatures, with systems. He was a translator between realms, but also between ages. His ministry was intergenerational, affecting people who would be born long after the petitions were first tendered. He took delight in that sprawl of influence. It made his work feel less urgent in a frenetic way and more enduring in a patient sense. There were symbolic objects in the court that aided memory, a lamp for each compassionate act, a thread for each named person. These symbols were not childish trinkets but mnemonic devices that helped the throne and its attendants recall the particularities of creation. Enoch would often touch these objects when he prayed, letting their tangibility anchor his pleading. They served as reminders that every act of attention counts. He had learned that intercession is itself a kind of formation. Those who engaged in it were shaped by the very practice of tending to others' needs. Over time, Enoch's character bore the marks of that shaping: steadier patience, a wider charity, a shorter temper for injustice. Intercession did not merely alter outcomes, it altered the intercessor. Sometimes the court would grant unusual requests that seemed to blend providence with human freedom in surprising ways. A leader might be moved to repent in a moment of startling clarity, and whole regions would shift direction. Enoch did not take credit for these miracles. He accepted them as proof that prayer and moral action can move the hand of history. He continued, nonetheless, to petition for the everyday changes that make such moments possible. There were seasons of apprenticeship where Enoch trained others in the art of pleading. He taught the discipline of listening, the craft of telling a story convincingly, the wisdom of restraint. His students learned to be honest about their motives and to respect the complexity of the cases they would carry. He emphasized that the work was always about serving life, not accumulating influence. Even as teacher, Enoch remained a learner. He encountered questions that widened his mind. Could one petition alter the commitments of a culture? How does one balance mercy with the need to deter harm? These inquiries pushed him to expand his theological imagination, to think in systems and histories and not only in immediate remedies. He sought counsel and conversation with other wise beings in the court, recognizing the communal nature of discernment. Over time, some of his petitions took on a meditative form, less pleading and more attunement. He would sit in the court and breathe with the tempo of compassion, letting the presence of the throne shape his heart. In those moments, his petitions became part of an ongoing liturgy of love, a sustained attention that shaped the atmosphere. He found profound peace in this rhythm of attention and release. He knew sorrow well, but he refused to be defined by it. He balanced mourning with hope, learning to let grief refine rather than flatten him. When he returned to the world to meet people again, he carried both that refined sorrow and a steadier hope. People felt the difference. He had an air of sympathy that did not collapse into despair, a warmth that invited trust. Enoch's intercession was not confined to private individuals alone. He petitioned for the natural world as well. He cared for rivers and forests, for the cycles of seasons and the creatures that moved within them. He understood that human flourishing was interwoven with ecological harmony, and he argued for stewardship before the throne. In doing so, he widened the moral domain to include the non-human and taught those who followed him to see creation as worthy of care. There were moments of grandeur in the court, times when the throne's voice seemed to reshape entire horizons. Those times were awe-inspiring and humbling. Enoch rarely sought them. He preferred the daily, steady work of tending. Yet he did not shirk from the grandeur when it came. He welcomed it as a reminder of the scale of love that governs all things. He sometimes reflected on the paradox of being both an elder of sorts and forever a pilgrim. He had accrued wisdom, but wisdom never stopped him from learning. In his humility, he remained open to being corrected by those younger in years but wiser in certain particulars. That openness prevented him from becoming calcified and kept his intercession lively and responsive. Language itself became a tool in his hands. He learned the cadence of petitions and how to shape them so they landed faithfully. He knew which metaphors softened a heart and which images sharpened the mind. He avoided the cheap rhetoric of flattery and the bluntness of accusation, favoring instead the careful grammar of honesty and invitation. Words were not weapons for him but instruments of rapprochement. Those who came to know Enoch's work often spoke of a certain dignity he brought to their suffering. He treated sorrow not as a flaw but as an element of human dignity that deserved recognition. That posture transformed those who were heard. They found themselves becoming more lucid about their needs and more ready to act on them. Dignity, in his hands, became a membrane through which compassion passed. He commemorated anniversaries of deliverances in small, private rites, silent meals, walks around familiar trees, songs hummed in the dawn. These remembrances were not for public spectacle but for the internal sustenance of gratitude. Enoch knew that remembering is an ethical act. It trains the soul to recognize ongoing gifts and prevents gratitude from becoming a mere sentiment. In the court, metrics existed, not as a tally of success, but as records of mercy enacted and lives healed. Enoch respected those records, but he measured success in human terms: renewed relationships, restored dignity, communities made safer. He resisted a utilitarian calculus that would reduce persons to outcomes, insisting instead that each person had intrinsic worth beyond measurable change. There were friends in the court who shared his passion and his weariness, companions who would sit with him in long, unproductive vigils and hold the space when answers did not come. These friendships sustained him. They modeled for him the value of companionship in spiritual work, that presence matters more than immediate productivity, that company can carry hope when one person's faith runs low. He also encountered cynicism, which he met with a mix of realism and gentle challenge. He would not romanticize stubborn ugliness, but he refused to accept cynicism as a final posture. In conversation, he often asked simple, disarming questions that nudged cynics to articulate both their wounds and their hopes. Many found that being heard in that honest way began to unwind the layers of cynicism and open them to fresh possibility. The way he met cynicism still speaks to us today. Subscribe and write in the comments where you find yourself more often, stuck in disbelief or reaching for a bit of hope. As he aged, if one can speak of aging in a realm where time is different, Enoch's face carried the lines of many stories. Those lines were not merely signs of fatigue but maps of fidelity. People in the world recognized him as a man whose life had been lived in service, and they trusted him because trust accumulates when one is consistent. His intercession changed the culture of those who learned from him. Communities began to practice forms of mutual care modeled on his petitions, naming needs precisely, protecting the vulnerable proactively, investing in restorative practices. Those shifts were not instantaneous revolutions but slow glows that expanded across neighborhoods and then regions. Enoch took satisfaction in these slow tides, knowing that sustainable change often advances by patient diffusion. He continued to marvel at the way humanity kept surprising itself. Even after centuries of cruelty, people could still perform acts of exquisite tenderness. Even after institutional coldness, leaders could repent. These moments invigorated him. They reminded him that intercession is not an exercise in futility but a form of attentive work aimed at cooperating with the possibility of moral reawakening. Sometimes the court gave him difficult insights. A request he had hoped for would be granted, but in a form that entailed suffering that no one could have foreseen. He learned to sit with the paradox of a good outcome that required passing through pain. These instances refined his pastoral skill, teaching him how to support those who rejoice while tenderly acknowledging the cost that was paid. Enoch held a deep conviction that prayer and action are not substitutes but partners. He encouraged those he represented to take responsibility where they could, to reconcile where repair was possible, to protect where protection was necessary, to provide where provision was lacking. Intercession, in his mind, did not relieve humans of responsibility, it accompanied and empowered it. He was careful to avoid spiritual arrogance, the presumption that one's petitions alone determined outcomes. He knew that humility before the throne required acknowledging the sovereignty of mystery. He taught others to pray boldly but to yield their petitions to a wisdom greater than their own. That balance of boldness and humility became a hallmark of his ministry. Enoch sometimes received letters, metaphorical notes, from the future in which people described how a small mercy had altered their descendants' lives. These narratives were not predictions but testimonials that the court preserved as encouragement. Reading them, he felt both the weight and the joy of intergenerational impact. He realized that his work was part of a long relay race across time. He took pleasure in simple symbolic acts, lighting a single candle for hope, lifting a small stone to represent burden and placing it at the throne's foot, tying threads into a garment to symbolize repaired relationships. These acts were not magical shortcuts but embodied prayers that helped people participate in the petitioning process. They made spiritual activity tactile and accessible. Enoch's patience had limits, but they were generous limits. He could be fierce in his advocacy when the dignity of the vulnerable was threatened. That fierceness was not a lack of mercy but its rigorous protection. He would speak sharply when systems of oppression attempted to normalize injustice, defending the poor and the marginalized with a moral clarity that demanded attention. He learned the art of discernment about when to speak publicly and when to act in silence. Public declarations can mobilize heart and resources, but they can also inflame and polarize. Enoch weighed these ramifications carefully, advocating for transparency when it served the common good and for discretion when it preserved the dignity of those involved. In those private moments of counsel, he would sometimes reveal to petitioners the broader picture of the court's wisdom, when appropriate. He never exploited such knowledge for manipulation, rather, he used it to reassure and to guide. Revealing a sliver of perspective could help someone endure a painful season by giving them context for suffering and hope. There were seasons of harvest, times when a long string of petitions bore fruit and communities celebrated together. Those communal rejoicings were sweet relief to Enoch, confirming that persistent tenderness can alter the texture of communal life. He would stand at the edge and watch children run, elders embrace, and neighbors share bread, feeling the quiet gratitude that came with the sight of repair. He knew when to let go. Intercession does not mean clutching control. Sometimes it means releasing a petition with trust and rest. He practiced at relinquishing, learning to place outcomes in hands that were more capacious than his own. Letting go was not resignation but an act of faith in the ordered love that governs the cosmos. Even as the centuries rolled forward, Enoch remained attentive to the new forms of human expression, new languages, new technologies, new modes of community. He adapted his petitions and his teaching to speak into these developments, acknowledging the creative power of human invention while cautioning about its potential for harm. He believed in innovation that respected human dignity and guarded against innovation that objectified people. He found solace in recurring images: a child rescued from a well, a family reunited after years of estrangement, a leader who repented at last. These images were anchors of hope that he would summon in dark hours. They reminded him that the fabric of life, though marred, was resilient and could be rewoven with care. Enoch's final years, if time can be said to end in a realm that accommodates eternity, were marked by a deep peace. He had lived a life of patient kneading of the world's wounds, and he felt that his labor had borne fruit even if not all things had been restored. In his quiet moments, he prayed not for his own reputation but that those he had served might know freedom and dignity. He reflected on the paradox of mediatorship. One must always be both near and far, both engaged and detached, advocate and servant. That tension kept him honest and dynamic. He would recommend to any who followed him a single discipline above others: fidelity to the particular person. Never let abstractions trump the real, living human before you. Treat them with the respect due to a name called into being. At last, in the best sense, his life was a long summons to compassion's grammar: listen, name, bring, protect, and release. His days before the throne were not a parade of spectacle but a steady ministry of presence. For those who would listen, Enoch's life teaches that intercession is less about pleading for power than about cultivating a posture of attentiveness that honors the dignity of every created being. He was a man who walked with a kind of unhurried certainty, the sort of certainty that seems to come from evenings spent under stars and mornings spent in quiet, private councils with the edges of the world. They call him Enoch in the old fragments, a name that carries a hush, and he moves through the earliest pages of memory as if the sky itself had once leaned down to speak in his ear. The story that clings to his name is one of trespass and testimony, of angels who fell and a human who rose to plead on behalf of the earth. Listening to this tale feels like stepping into a chapel where the air still remembers a hymn half sung and the walls remember footsteps that never quite fade. To tell the story fully is to begin at the moment when prophecy feels less like a lightning strike and more like a patient craft, like drawing a line through time that gathers shadows and light in equal measure. Enoch appears not as a hero victorious in battle, but as a witness and as a scribe, entrusted with knowledge that sits uneasily on human lips. He is given visions that will not be contained, histories that unspool into future judgments, and a mission that calls him to stand between the clamoring of fallen things and the silence of holiness. His voice, in the old texts, is both the voice of a man and the echo of a courtroom where the earth itself is represented. The Watchers, those heavenly beings who abandoned their appointed places, disturb the story from the start like a sudden chill in a warm room. They descend, driven by desire and curiosity, convincing themselves that they act like benefactors when in truth their gifts are salt upon the wound of innocence. They teach metallurgy and cosmetics as if they were mere curiosities, like loose tools handed to a child, unaware or indifferent to the havoc that comes when power meets unformed hands. What begins as instruction mutates into corruption because the lines between instruction and domination blur when heaven crosses the threshold into human life. The transgression is not only in the giving of forbidden knowledge, but in the taking of what was not theirs to take, songs of intimacy sung in the wrong court. They take brides from the daughters of men, and those unions do not result in ordinary children, they produce giants, the Nephilim, figures who loom in the memory like broken pillars, both marvelous and monstrous. These offspring bend the created world, teaching violence as if it were a craft to be perfected, and the earth answers them in kind, groaning under weight it was never meant to bear. The flood that follows is not merely meteorological, it is the universe trying to wash a stain the way rivers polish a stone. Enoch's response to all of this is not to brandish weaponry or to call down instantaneous vengeance. Instead, he climbs, he pleads, and he walks the long, narrow path of intercession. In the ancient accounts, he is drawn upward, sometimes led by angels, sometimes by a light that unfolds like a map, until he stands in places where words do not have to be precise to cut through pretense. His petitions are formal and relentless, not sentimental, the kind of pleading that knows the difference between noise and true argument. He becomes a kind of advocate who understands divine law in the small print, that every deed has its echo and every echo returns to a center that cannot be deceived. The heavens, in these visions, are not a single room but a series of courts and chambers, each with a different light and a different kind of judge. Enoch moves through these courts like someone who has studied the stairs of a great house and knows which landing leads to mercy and which to impossibility. In one place he watches celestial watchers tally the deeds of men, and in another he hears the voices of nameless counting keepers, things that measure the weight of days. These scenes are described with a vividness that can make a listener imagine hearing ledger pages turn, the sound of accounts being settled in a scale that extends beyond human comprehension. His intercession takes on a legal quality because the transgression of the Watchers is itself juridical. They have violated boundaries and covenants, and in response the cosmos must pronounce a remedy. Enoch does not invent that remedy, he articulates it before powers that are both offended and ordered, and he asks for a resolution that is neither cruelty nor neglect but restoration. He petitions relentlessly for those who cannot speak for themselves, and his words are recorded, sealed, and carried like summonses to chambers that do not suffer noise. The drama is both spiritual and bureaucratic, a kind of holy litigation in which the fate of the earth turns on the articulation of terms. The archangels emerge in these accounts with a precise, unadorned authority, and they are the ones charged with carrying out what the higher court decrees. Michael becomes the commander who binds, Raphael the healer whose name feels like a closure to things that were wounded, Gabriel the messenger of awful clarity. They descend to seize the leaders of the rebellion, and the descriptions of their actions are not cinematic violence so much as the careful application of law, ropes that become chains at the words of a verdict, pits opened where silence will find a new home. The watchers are bound and consigned, not merely to punishment but to a detention that carries with it a finality the world will remember across generations. Enoch watches and reports, and his account becomes a text that shapes how later readers understand culpability and mercy. The voice that records the sentence is not triumphant, it is precise, sorrowful, aware of the cost that even ordained punishment extracts from the universe. He knows that the harshness of a sentence is sometimes a kind of medicine, and he sees the slow arithmetic of consequences. Knowledge spread without wisdom becomes a weapon. Alliances broken create cycles of retribution, and punishment that is merely punitive often calls forth more ruin. He does not take pleasure in naming the fates of those who have fallen, but he insists on a transparency in the administration of justice that will stand as evidence across time. Enoch's ascents are described with a geography that feels almost architectural, as if the cosmos is a cathedral built on levels, each with its own windows and icons. In one hall there are gates of fire, in another a river of angelic sounds, and in another a place where the stars themselves are catalogued and their stories told. Enoch learns to read those stories as if they were letters, to understand how comets might be warnings and how constellations can be testimonies to divine patience. The heavenly library he visits contains names and destinies, lists and reckonings, and he records them with the meticulous care of a scribe who knows the permanence of ink. There is a kind of moral logic in these visions. Actions have textures, and those textures attract responses. The Watcher's descent is treated as a breach that destabilizes the moral fabric. The flood is the earth's attempt to renew that fabric. Enoch's role is to articulate an ethic of repair, to speak on behalf of a world still salvageable, and to insist that even in the face of cosmic disorder, order is possible. His intercession is a bridge between a justice that would obliterate and a mercy that would heal, and he teaches by example how to stand in the place where both are acknowledged. The Book of Enoch, as a text, collects these tales in language that is both ceremonial and intimate, and it circulates in margins and monasteries and among those who collect relics of meaning. It is not canonical everywhere, but that does not diminish its power. Rather, it allows the book to act as a kind of subterranean river, nourishing traditions that will sprout in unexpected places. Scholars and storytellers alike have pulled on its threads, sometimes to find prophecy, sometimes to read early myth-making, and sometimes to trace the genealogies of why societies fear the mingling of boundaries. Enoch's account becomes a mirror for communities who need a language for cosmic wrongs and for the ways those wrongs are repaired. The potency of the Book of Enoch lies in its refusal to separate the celestial from the terrestrial, to treat them as distinct realms whose interactions are either trivial or inevitable. Instead, it insists the two are braided in a manner that requires careful tending, like strands of a craft passed down from one generation to the next. The Watcher's teachings, when removed from context, appear as useful skills. When kept within their context, they are recognized as accelerants of human hubris. Enoch's insistence on context is why his voice remains haunting. He knows that knowledge without covenant becomes a tool for predation, and he speaks to that knowledge as one might speak to a fever. The narrative gives us intimations of a cosmic courtroom where not only acts but intentions are evaluated, where the sound of a prayer is weighed in the same way a blow is felt. Enoch's intercession brings before the court the pleas of a groaning creation and the petitions of men who cannot plead for themselves. He names wrongs and requests remedies, and his petitions read like a legal brief written in the language of faith. That merging of legalism and devotion creates a strange music, like a chant given structure by statute, and it lingers in listeners because it tells them that mercy can be procedural as well as passionate. There is an almost human weariness to Enoch's pleading, as if he knows the futility of words that do not alter the habits of the heart. Yet he persists, because persistence itself becomes an act of moral formation. The world is changed not only by decrees but by the stamina of those who refuse to let injustice pass unremarked. His repetition is not redundancy, it is insistence, an embodied theology that cultivates the soil of the world by refusing to let the weeds of despair spread unchallenged. In that persistence, he teaches a difficult lesson, that intercession is not a one-time lift but a lifelong lifting. The Watcher's punishment is detailed in a way that treats cosmic correction almost like a surgical procedure, precise, necessary, and irreversible in its consequences. Chains are fashioned not to torment but to contain, to prevent a recurrence of rupture, to set boundaries that were previously ignored. They are cast into deep pits where silence can work, where violence cannot be rehearsed in the light, and the description reads like a catalogue of containment rather than a celebration of suffering. Enoch records these measures with the sober tones of someone who knows containment can allow for eventual restoration, that a wound needs pressure to stop bleeding long enough for tissue to knit. When we listen closely to these scenes, we notice that punishment and hope are not opposites but partners in a strange choreography. The narrative repeatedly reminds us that judgment carries the seeds of order, not merely of retribution, and that to name a wrong is also to begin the work of mending. Enoch insists on this duality. It is why he pleads for precise judgments rather than indiscriminate annihilation. Alive in his words is an ethic that values the form of correction, not merely its severity. The giants born of the union between Watchers and human women are described in ways that make them both tragic and threatening, immense in scale, disproportionate in appetites, and profoundly ill-suited to the world they inhabit. They do more than feed on the landscape, they feed on societies, teaching weapons and violence as if technique could replace restraint. The narrative draws a line between abundance and excess, and the Nephilim stand on the wrong side of that line, a living caution against prosperity unmoored from humility. Enoch's horror at their presence is not merely aesthetic, it is prudential, an urgent warning about what ungoverned magnitude does to human moral imagination. There are moments in Enoch's journeys where the text becomes lyrical, where the cosmos is described as if it were a garment with embroidered history stitched into its hem. Stars are sown with names, winds whisper prophecies, mountains hold counsel. These images are not mere decoration, they are signposts for readers who need to imagine a world saturated with meaning at every level. Enoch teaches that to read the world is to see God's handwriting in the ordinary and the extraordinary alike. Enoch's transformation from a man who walks with God to one who walks in the courts of heaven is gradual and precise, like a metamorphosis that keeps the person intact while changing his role. He is human unlike the angels, but his intimacy with them reshapes how he perceives obligation and law. He becomes a mediator who neither claims divine prerogatives nor reduces himself to a mere mortal bystander. He holds an intermediary position that is both humble and authoritative. That ambiguity is the story's power. Enoch is close enough to both worlds to carry messages without dissolving into either. When the flood is announced, it is not presented as arbitrary wrath, but as a final, cleansing answer to a pattern of recurring corruption. The narrative frames it as a last resort, a reset that the cosmos takes when other means have been exhausted. Noah's Ark becomes a technical solution but also a moral symbol, survival through obedience and carefulness, not through domination. Enoch's role in preparing the moral terms of such a reset again shows him as an interpreter of both law and mercy. The longer you stay with these scenes, the more you realize how they speak to the human predicament across eras, not only to a narrow ancient world. They show what happens when boundaries dissolve, between species, between roles, between the sacred and the ordinary, and they ask how a society reparatively responds. That inquiry is timeless because boundaries in human lives are constantly at risk, ethical, social, spiritual. In this way, Enoch's intercession reads like a manual for communities that must learn to enforce limits without becoming cruel. Textual history complicates the story because Enoch's book exists in fragments and in responses, gathered and dispersed, argued over by communities who either embraced or pushed it aside. Some collected it as scripture, others watched it circulate like a seed carried on wind. Its influence is diffuse. New Testament authors echo its imagery, Jewish mystics absorb and transform it, and medieval scribes tuck its phrases into margins. The book works like yeast in cultural dough, making possible flavors that would otherwise never rise. As generations interpret Enoch differently, the figure himself becomes a mirror that reflects the priorities of those who read him. In some traditions he is a cosmic archivist, in others a liturgist of the skies, and in still others a precursor to a divine prototype who will sit at the right hand of a lawful throne. The multiplicity of readings shows the text's adaptability. It can be read as alarm, as consolation, as instruction, depending on the pulse of the reader. This adaptability is itself a kind of testimony to Enoch's continuing relevance. To approach the Book of Enoch is to be invited into a long conversation about law, power, knowledge, and the limits of influence. It asks whether knowledge is good in itself or whether it must be coupled to wisdom, and it dramatizes this question in a cosmic courtroom where angels are as fallible as men. The themes are deeply ethical. When does teaching become domination? When does innovation become hubris? And who gets to set the terms for permissible knowledge? Enoch's voice responds as if the only secure answer requires both law and tenderness. The story also operates as a moral cosmology. The structure of the heavens in Enoch's account imposes order on chaos by making space for accountability, for naming, for time-bound decrees. Each level has a function, and each punishment is matched to the crime in a way that suggests a universe wired for measured justice. Enoch's descriptions of these structures offer consolation to readers who need to trust that the cosmos is not indifferent to wrong. Enoch's intercession touches on the paradox of pleading. You must accept the reality of wickedness while still insisting on remedies that preserve life. He does not minimize the watcher's guilt, he magnifies the urgency of repair. That posture makes him a figure of immense courage, because to plead at such heights is to risk being dismissed as naive. Yet he persists, and his persistence converts skepticism into obligation because it insists the cosmos answer for itself. Reading his words today, one hears the same tension that modern societies confront, the need to balance innovation with restraint, progress with wisdom. The Watcher's teachings on metallurgy and cosmetics are not inherently evil, rather, they are usages that become dangerous when separated from restraint. Our technologies today might be likened to those ancient gifts, powerful and double-edged, and the text invites us to think about who should wield them and to what ends. Enoch's warnings become strikingly contemporary. Knowledge without accountability fragments societies as surely as it did in those old memories. The legalism of the text does not mean it lacks poetry. Indeed, its legal passages often carry a tear in them, a human grief that leaks into statute. Enoch's petitions have a rhythm like prayer and a cadence like a lawyer's brief, and that combination makes his voice memorable. He does not merely recite wrongs, he asks for their naming to be a step toward reconciliation, where possible. The mixture of law and lament is what gives the narrative its particular emotional intelligence. There are moments when Enoch's descriptions become unexpectedly tender, especially when he pauses to describe the earth itself, its rivers, its mountains, its simple creatures, and frames them as plaintiffs in a case against cosmic arrogance. His love for the created order breaks through the legal formulas and appears in small, luminous images: a bird learning to fly, the way rain touches soil, the dignity of hands that work the land. These touches humanize his plea and remind listeners that cosmic disputes have terrestrial victims whose names deserve to be said. As the agents of punishment act, there is a moral economy at work that the narrative explores with subtlety: confinement, remediation, and the hope of eventual restoration. The book does not promise easy healing, it promises a method, a disciplined mercy that takes the long view. This patience is significant because the story insists that lasting repair is a slow art, one that refuses cheap fixes. Enoch's intercession is thus also a lesson in time and the kinds of endurance real mending demands. Different communities have taken different lessons from these motifs. Some see Enoch as an ascetic exemplar, a man to emulate in silence and prayer. Others read him as a proto-mystic who traveled the inner cosmos. Still others treat him as a mythic historian, a collector of primordial testimonies meant to explain why the world is as it is. Each reading sheds light on a facet of the text and helps it remain alive in the cultural imagination. The figure of the Watchers has also been reimagined across centuries, sometimes as cautionary specters and moral tales, sometimes as metaphors for corrupted leadership. Their story warns of the ease with which those meant to guide can become those who dominate, a theme as old as governance itself. In that way, the Book of Enoch enters into political conversation without ever explicitly naming kings or empires. It teaches by allegory and angle, and its lessons are portable across ages and systems. Enoch's ascent is not only vertical but also inward, and readers find that the more they follow his path upward, the more they confront the interior geography of their own choices. To be an intercessor in this sense requires the courage to say truth to power and the humility to admit that one's own hands are not spotless. The narrative models a moral posture where the speaker refuses both sycophancy and despair, offering instead a disciplined hope that gathers stubbornly at the edges of possibility. The mystical strands in later traditions pick up on Enoch's liminal quality and transform him into figures like Metatron in certain mystical texts, a being who straddles creation and the divine with a unique authority. That development is not in the earliest accounts, but it grows naturally from his intermediary role and the desire of later readers to imagine someone who could sit comfortably in both courts. This evolution of character tells us as much about the interpretive needs of later communities as it does about Enoch himself. People wanted a presence who could translate between worlds. The Book of Enoch's intercessor model influences how communities imagine advocacy. It becomes a template for spiritual representation that emphasizes accountability and pleading over coercion. In liturgical traditions, this model informs prayers that are structured more as argument than as supplication, as if the faithful stand in a courtroom and argue for the world. This legal turn in prayer is an unusual feature of religious practice and one that has shaped certain devotional styles through the centuries. One can hear echoes of Enoch's intercession in varied religious rhetoric, even where the text itself is unknown. Leaders who argue for structural reform, lawyers who plead for the voiceless, activists whose rhetoric combines moral outrage with procedural demands. These are contemporary expressions of the same basic instinct Enoch models. The ancient story thus continues to speak because it addresses universal tensions, how to answer wrongdoing, whom to hold responsible, and how to craft responses that restore rather than annihilate. To sit with the narrative at length is to notice its careful attention to naming. Names are not incidental but powerful, and Enoch records them as if naming were a sacrament. The names of angels, the names of stars, the names of the Watchers themselves, each carries intention and destiny. In a world where names bind and free, Enoch understands that to name is to participate in creation, to fix realities into their lawful places. That theology of naming ripples outward into later traditions that insist on the holiness of speech. The tone of the Book of Enoch varies between the austere and the lyrical, and that fluctuation keeps listeners attentive. It is like walking through a landscape that alternates between steep cliffs and gentle meadows. You never quite settle into a single feeling because the text refuses to be categorized as holy doom or holy consolation. Instead, it remains dynamically honest, oscillating between despair and hope in a way that feels true to the complexity of human life. This tonal elasticity is an important reason the book endures. It is not afraid of contradiction. There is also a theological seriousness in the way Enoch treats sin. It is never dismissed as mere error nor grotesquely simplified into a cartoon of evil. Instead, sin is described as structural, persuasive, infectious, and sometimes accidental insofar as humans replicate patterns they do not fully comprehend. The text thus calls for remedies that are not merely punitive but also educational, restorative, and preventive. That comprehensive approach to wrongdoing offers a framework for thinking about contemporary social ills as more than individual moral failures. Even the most dramatic images, chains dropping from heaven, giants collapsing under the weight of their own appetite, are used by the text to teach rather than to titillate. The Book of Enoch uses spectacle to direct attention to ethical questions rather than to provide sensationalism. Every dramatic detail folds back into the didactic core, to show what unchecked power looks like, to make visible the consequences of transgressing sacred boundaries. In that disciplined use of imagery, the book practices a kind of moral pedagogy. A listener who lingers with Enoch's pleadings will begin to sense their contemporary resonances: corporate greed that scales like the Nephilim, technological knowledge surrendered without governance, and charismatic authority unmoored from accountability. The story does not map onto modern structures in one-to-one fashion, of course, but its metaphors remain instructive. Enoch's ancient courtroom offers a template for evaluating novelty with caution and for insisting that progress be married to responsibility. The phrase that Enoch walks with God evokes a companionship that is neither casual nor possessive. It is a walking alongside as a witness and a friend. That metaphor of walking captures the ethical rhythm of his life: steady, attentive, relational. He does not sprint for fame or hide in solitary sanctuaries. He moves through the world and through the heavens with a presence that is steady enough to bear both sorrow and obligation. His path is pedagogical. He teaches by presence, and his presence becomes a living syllogism of devotion. The cosmic scales that appear in the book remind us that the universe, as Enoch sees it, has a moral architecture where balance is sought and restored with purpose. The scales are not arbitrary but calibrated by a creator who knows the weight of actions and the texture of remorse. Enoch pleads within this structure, and his arguments often hinge on the possibility of recalibration, not merely retribution. This vision gives us a hope that even the worst distortions can be rebalanced given time, law, and honest pleading. As the narrative winds toward its most consequential moments, the language grows both more urgent and more patient, as if a clock is being wound that will not snap but will eventually toll. The removal of the Watchers from the earth and the sealing of the Nephilim's fate close a chapter, but the book also opens a question about human responsibility moving forward. If their interference taught humanity certain arts, then humans are left to steward those arts with wisdom or ruinous pride. Enoch's intercession thus becomes a handing off, a last counsel at the moment when responsibility is again returned to human hands. Enoch's final transformations, hinted at in some traditions, carry a paradoxical serenity: a man changed by proximity to the divine who remains both human and held. Whether he is translated, transformed, or simply remembered as one who walked with God, his story ends not with triumphalism but with a continuing invitation to care. The conclusion is not an absolute end but a charge to readers and listeners to take up intercession in their own spheres, to stand in the breach between justice and mercy. This final note is not a dramatic flourish, it is an enactment of the book's abiding ethic. The narrative's multilayered legal, moral, and poetic registers make it a fertile ground for reflection, and many have turned to it in times of communal crisis. When societies worry, they often need stories that make sense of chaos, and Enoch's story offers a way to understand cosmic disorder without surrendering to nihilism. It provides a vocabulary for lament that is forward-looking and a pedagogy for reform that refuses to accept easy answers. Its influence thus crosses the boundaries between private devotion and public ethics. Reading the Book of Enoch is a slow work of attention because its layered metaphors refuse simple paraphrase. You cannot read it as mere myth nor as straightforward scripture without losing some of its complexity. It sits between genres like a river that divides and reunites, carrying both sediment and sunlight. The text rewards patience. The longer one listens, the more its images become tools for moral imagination rather than mere curiosities. It trains the ear to hear complaint as a summons and the cosmos as a court where each voice matters. Enoch's insistence on precise naming and meticulous record-keeping can be read as a defense of memory itself, a protest against forgetting. The Book of Enoch understands that memory is a civic duty. To remember wrongdoing is to prevent its repeat, and to record mercy is to make reconciliation plausible. In an age where memory is constantly curated and contested, Enoch's scrupulous chronicling feels both ancient and urgently modern. He binds the past to the present by refusing to let scandal go unnamed. The figure of Enoch also invites reflection on what it means to be chosen for a difficult task. His election is not an escape from the world but an entrance into its moral complexities. He is not set apart to avoid suffering so much as to understand it more intimately and to carry that understanding into the courts of heaven. This vision resists any simplistic dichotomy between sanctity and suffering. Enoch is holy precisely because he engages suffering with both law and tenderness. That engagement is the model his readers are asked to emulate. In many ways, the story is a study in accountability. Being accountable requires one to know and name wrongs, to call them exactly what they are, and to propose remedial structures that do not simply replicate harm. Enoch teaches that the measure of a society is not its power but its capacity to repair what its powers have harmed. That measure is a sobering standard, demanding not only courage but also a lifelong commitment to the slow craft of restoration. Enoch's intercession therefore becomes a template for ethical governance and civic renewal. There are poetic moments in which Enoch's pleading seems less like a legal brief and more like a love letter to creation, lines that dwell on the small beauties threatened by violence. He lingers on seas and rivers and the quiet ways that creatures find their place, and in doing so he builds a case for tenderness as a political priority. That emphasis on care reframes power. True authority is exercised in protection and repair, not in dominance. The Book of Enoch thus nudges listeners toward a politics that honors vulnerability. As you continue to absorb these images, you begin to notice how the text's moral clarity functions not by reducing complexity but by holding it in tension. Enoch insists that wrongdoing is real and devastating, yet his remedy requires a patience and craft that honors life. It is a theological posture that refuses either despair or triumphalism, choosing instead a steady stewardship that can hold broken things together until they heal. This uncertain steadiness is the book's enduring gift to readers who live in a world where solutions are rarely simple. The legal metaphors in the story also invite reflection on how we adjudicate technological ethics today, when innovations spread faster than our capacity to legislate them. The Watcher's offerings were knowledge with consequences, and our modern inventions often mirror that dynamic, tools that can liberate as well as destroy. Enoch's insistence on frameworks, on naming and regulation, becomes eerily relevant as we confront questions about artificial tongues, gene edits, and unmapped powers. His voice suggests that moral imagination must accompany technological creativity if we hope to avoid repeating ancient mistakes. Across centuries, Enoch's narrative has been a crossroads where myth, law, and mysticism meet and mingle. Some readers come seeking prophecy, others, comfort, others still, etiologies for why human life so often tilts into violence. The book refuses to be confined to a single function, and its adaptability is part of its power. It becomes, for many, a text that can be read in layers, each new reading uncovering further depth. One of the striking features of the Book of Enoch is its portrayal of the cosmic as intimately involved in human affairs. It refuses the notion that the divine sovereign is aloof or indifferent to the small injustices of the world, insisting instead on a participation that sometimes looks judicial, sometimes parental, sometimes artisan-like. This intermittent closeness provides comfort. The universe is not a background but a participant in the moral life. Enoch, in his roles as witness and intercessor, demonstrates what it looks like to be attentive to that participation. The theme of boundary, between the human and the divine, between knowledge and restraint, between innovation and ethics, repeats throughout the book with a kind of musical insistence. Boundaries are not merely prohibitions, they are protective devices designed to sustain relational flourishing. When the Watchers cross them, the ripple effects are catastrophic. When Enoch argues for their restitution, he is arguing on behalf of a fragile order. Listeners come to understand that the book's concerns are intimately practical. It proposes rules not to restrict joy but to make joy possible in the long term. Enoch's voice also complicates the idea of intercession as purely petition. It makes intercession an act of education and a form of civic courage. He instructs the court with evidence and reason, and that pedagogy is part of his advocacy. His approach models a civic virtue we call deliberation, the patient work of assembling facts, of naming harms, and of proposing remedies that can bind a community together again. In this model, prayer and policy are not enemies but partners in the task of repair. The symbolism of chains and pits, while stark, also carries hints of containment as a therapeutic necessity. The bindings are described as instruments that allow for a pause in which healing might be possible, not as ends in themselves. This nuance is important because it resists the temptation to either glorify punishment or to ignore the necessity of firm boundaries. The book insists both on the seriousness of holding offenders accountable and on the possibility that such measures might lead to eventual restoration. The persistence of the Book of Enoch in liturgical and mystical traditions suggests that communities have repeatedly found in it a resource for shaping ethical life. Religious movements looking for a vocabulary to address structural evil or leadership corruption often return to Enoch's courtroom because it offers both moral clarity and theological depth. Its language enters sermons and prayers, and it shapes how communities imagine the relationship between heaven and earth. This enduring presence is evidence of the book's capacity to speak across ages about perennial concerns. If you let the narrative sit with you, you will notice how Enoch's hearings teach a kind of moral grammar: name, plead, measure, restore. That grammar is compact but capacious, able to address sins both personal and communal. It is not a mechanistic formula but a way of attending that cultivates both courage and compassion. The simplicity of the sequence makes it accessible, while the complexity of its implications ensures it is never simplistic. One of the text's quieter teachings is its insistence on the dignity of creation apart from human utility. Enoch's pleading is not merely instrumental, it recognizes that rivers and birds and mountains have intrinsic value, not only worth as resources. This attention to intrinsic worth feeds into a broader ecological ethics that later readers find useful. The Book of Enoch thus anticipates modern concerns about stewardship and the moral significance of habitat and species, urging a reverence for the created order that resists reduction to human use alone. There is also an ethical humility in Enoch's posture. He does not presume to alter divine will, but he does request clarity and proportionality. His voice is neither subservient nor presuming, it seeks to align human pleas with cosmic justice. That humility is instructive because it models how to advocate, not with entitlement but with an earnest recognition of one's limitedness. Enoch's intercession thereby becomes both an ethic of advocacy and a school in humility. The narrative's legalism can be unsettling to readers who prefer a theology unmoored from procedure, but Enoch shows that procedure itself can be an expression of love if it is designed to uphold dignity. Rules, when constructed with care, act as supports rather than cages, and the book insists on this moral architecture. Its insistence on formalities, the recording of names, the sealing of decrees, the measured application of punishment, portrays a divine justice that is careful and exact, not capricious. That depiction comforts communities who fear arbitrary power. Enoch's story also invites us to consider the role of witnesses. Without witnesses, the world becomes a place where abuses are hidden and memory is lost. The scribe's role in the narrative underscores how essential testimony is to the moral order. Memory is a bulwark against repetition. Enoch's attentiveness to detail is thus not pedantic but foundational. Accurate witness is the first step toward correction. That lesson resonates especially in cultures that prize transparency and accountability. The ritual and liturgical echoes throughout the book reveal a society that valued ceremonial precision as a way to keep memory alive. The act of recording and reciting names becomes a form of prayer, a repetitive practice that shapes identity and community. In this way, the book functions as a liturgical manual for people who need practices to anchor them in times of moral flux. The recurrence of these ritualized acts testifies to the book's belief in habit as a moral teacher. As Enoch traverses the heavens, he often remarks on the harmony of the created order, and it is this harmony that the watcher's transgressions threaten. The narrative frames the cosmos as an orchestra where every element has a part, and when one instrument plays out of tune, the music becomes discordant. Enoch's intercession is, in part, a conductor's response. He insists that the score be corrected so the symphony can resume. That image of cosmic music offers a resonant metaphor for communities trying to restore collaboration after breach. The later mystical developments surrounding Enoch, turning him into a towering celestial figure in some traditions, speak to the human need to imagine the divine intermediary in forms that can be apprehended. These elaborations are not present in the earliest versions but grow organically from his intermediary role. Those later images of Enoch sometimes comfort and sometimes complicate, but they all testify to a deep hunger for mediators who can translate the divine will into human terms. The multiplicity of these visions shows how religious imagination reforms stories to meet new needs. Enoch's status as a bridge between judgment and mercy makes him a compelling figure for anyone who has ever felt responsible for others' well-being. His example pushes readers to think about what it means to stand in the breach, to be willing to be partly burdened for the sake of communal healing. It is a weighty vocation, requiring a blend of courage, patience, and imagination. Yet it is also an honor, the sort of moral calling that transforms those who answer it. The Book of Enoch challenges readers to hold paradox without collapsing into cynicism or facile optimism. Its moral vision is nuanced, insisting on the reality of cosmic order even as it acknowledges the fragility of human moral structures. That careful tension resists ideological simplification and invites a contemplative, weight-bearing response to injustice. For listeners today, the text offers a model of how to be both serious about reform and gentle in its execution. If you let the tale run through you, you will find that its cautionary arcs do not merely tell you what not to do but suggest how to fashion new institutions around humility and restraint. Enoch's procedures, recording names, sealing decrees, applying measured constraints, point to institutional designs that protect vulnerable spaces. His counsel can be read as a blueprint for civic life that prizes stewardship, accountability, and slow craft. In this respect, the ancient story functions as a manual for public ethics. The imagery of flying in translation serves as a metaphor for radical change without annihilation. Enoch does not destroy himself in ascent, nor does he lose his human moorings. He becomes transformed by proximity to the eternal, and that transformation is a mediation, not a disappearance. The narrative thus provides a model of sanctity that preserves personhood while expanding perspective. Such a model is both demanding and humane. It enlarges capacity without erasing human frailty. A recurring lesson in the book is the necessity of naming deeds precisely because precision makes repair possible. Vague condemnations of evil do little to repair broken things. Precise assessments enable targeted fixes. Enoch's intercessions are often surgical because he believes the remedy must match the malady. This discipline of exactitude has profound implications for how we do justice. Careful diagnosis precedes effective treatment. The Book of Enoch also teaches that cosmic order can be restored without denying the existence of free will. Boundaries can be enforced while still leaving room for repentance and transformation. The book's measures are not deterministic erasures but structured interventions meant to restore agency. In enforcing limits, the narrative paradoxically safeguards the possibility for moral choice, ensuring that freedom remains meaningful rather than destructive. This balance between law and liberty is a central ethical insight that Enoch offers. When later readers appropriate Enoch, they often do so because they need a vocabulary for both outrage and hope. His courtroom provides terms for righteous anger and well-structured remedies. It allows communities to name the seriousness of transgressions while also keeping open the possibility of repair. That dual utility helps explain why the figure survives in cultural memory even where the text itself is fragmentary. The story's insistence on proportionality and punishment is both radical and humane. It refuses disproportionate revenge and also refuses to minimize harm. Enoch's pleas often hinge on the idea that justice must be measured, and that measurement involves a knowledge of both the wrong and the remedy. The principle of proportionality protects the moral architecture from becoming vengeful, ensuring that correction remains aimed at restoration rather than annihilation. This moral restraint is perhaps one of the book's most enduring contributions to ethical thought. As you listen, you will notice how the story asks not only about the fate of angels and giants, but about the quietly heroic work of remembering, recording, and pleading. Enoch himself exemplifies this quiet heroism, showing that ordinary virtues, attention, memory, persistence, are foundational to cosmic repair. The text honors the scribe as much as the warrior because it understands that story and record are the scaffolding on which justice stands. This elevation of quiet craft is a countercultural message in every age. There is a sense in which Enoch's narrative asks us to reimagine leadership as service. Leaders must protect, not dominate. They must limit, not exploit. They must remember, not erase. This vision of leadership is disciplinary rather than theatrical, oriented toward the long-term care of the community rather than short-term displays of power. Enoch's court is a place where such leaders are both named and held accountable, modeled not by grandeur but by fidelity. The book's political theology thus nudges readers toward a humility of authority. The concluding images of Enoch are often quiet, almost domestic, reminding us that even the most cosmic callings have a human dimension. He walks with God as someone might walk with a friend along a worn path, stopping to notice small wonders and to intervene on behalf of the vulnerable. The intimacy of that image undercuts any notion that holiness requires detachment from human concern. Instead, holiness, in Enoch's vision, is precisely an engaged compassion that refuses to look away. Finally, the Book of Enoch's narrative endures because it does not merely present a past event but offers a perpetual practice: to watch, to name, to plead, and to repair. Its rhythms teach a way of being in the world that combines law and love, admonition and hope. For modern listeners juggling multiple responsibilities, this ancient intercessor stands as a reminder that attention matters. One witness can alter the course of cosmic litigation, and one consistent voice can summon judgment and mercy in equal measure. Enoch, the intercessor of heaven, therefore remains an invitation to hold the world with both justice and tenderness. They called him Enoch, a name that slips easily off the tongue and lingers like the memory of a song heard in the dark. He moved between the earth and the heavens with the unhurried authority of one who has learned to wait for doors to open, to listen for tones that only the patient can hear. His message was not sudden like thunder, but steady like a lamp tended through the night, and he carried it to those who had chosen a path away from the order they knew. In the quiet of his walk, he gathered every echo of what had been said and what might still be said, preparing himself to speak for more than himself. He came not as judge first, but as one who had been shown what judgment could mean if mercy were withheld. The rebels had names that shone like stars and shoulders that once bore the light of service, yet they had bent toward a fascination with their own brightness. They crowded into the ruptures they had made in the world, marveling at the new freedoms they had invented, unaware of the slow unspooling of consequence. Enoch saw this like a physician who studies the illness before prescribing cure. He did not rush to reprimand, but aimed to reveal the cost of a choice made against the grain of the whole. He went to them because someone had to be a bridge, someone who had seen both the court above and the streets below, and could speak both languages without losing meaning. He stood at thresholds, and places where the sky seemed a little nearer and the city a little quieter, and he began to unfold a voice that was both stern and soft. There was no thunder in his first words. Instead, he unfolded a memory, a remembrance of the original harmony that had shaped being. He mapped for them what order looked like when it worked, the way rivers kept to their courses, how trees opened toward the sun, how law held promises and bound wounds. For the rebels, who loved their autonomy, hearing about pattern felt at once like a consolation and a restraint. Enoch did not conceal that restraint. He simply reframed it as a safeguard of life rather than a cage on ambition. He told them of beginnings, not as ancient facts to be quoted, but as living seeds that still bore fruit. He spoke of the first trusts, simple things that proved how creation could cooperate, protection at dawn, the voice of seasons, the rhythm of bread and harvest. Each example was a small, concrete proof of what cooperation looked like, and in each proof he invited them to see a hand not as an instrument of domination but as a support for flourishing. The rebels listened, sometimes with an edge of impatience, because the language of mutuality was not what their pride expected. Yet even impatience can be a doorway when the words are persistent and true. Then he told them about the watchers, not with the cold distance of a chronicler, but with the intimate grief of one who had watched friends stray. The watchers had been meant to observe and to protect. They had been given vantage and trust, and they had used it to pursue curiosity that bent into desire. Enoch described how curiosity can twist when untethered, how admiration slides toward possession, and how to look without guarding against greed becomes the beginning of a fall. He painted their descent with tender accuracy, making sure the rebels understood the small steps that widen into chasms. His point was not to mock their folly, but to make them see its anatomy, so that recognition might lead to choice. He did not hide the gifts the rebels had once borne, the understanding of signs in the heavens, the shaping of language, the skill to teach, and the impulse to safeguard. Those talents, misapplied, had become instruments of pride. Rightly used, they were tools of restoration. Enoch asked them to remember the weight of a gift before they renounced its origin. He coaxed them to recall the faces that had taught them before they taught others. Memory became a kind of compass in his speech, a way to recalibrate decisions by tracing their lineage back to the hands that placed before them the very powers they now abused. By calling them back to lineage, he softened the rebels' sense of isolation, reminding them they were not solitary actors but part of a living chain. He told a story about a garden, not because gardens were foreign to them, but because gardens show care and motion. In his telling, the garden was a picture of responsibility, to water, to clear, to stand watch against the slow invasion of brambles. Those who had left the garden had not only abandoned a physical plot, they had renounced the practice of tending, and thus abandoned the art of steady patience. Enoch spoke of the dailiness of fidelity as a kind of heroism, quiet, repetitive, and infinitely more potent than any leap of defiance. The rebels, used to grand gestures, were forced to reconsider the extraordinary potential of humble stewardship. He offered them images of the heavens he had walked through, not to intimidate with grandeur but to translate the language of the skies into an ethic for the earth. He described corridors of light like conversation, not the monologue of power. Each star, he said, was a witness that remembered a promise. To bear witness meant to hold a covenant in sight, to be accountable over the long arc of time. This was perhaps his boldest move. He elevated the idea of testimony above spectacle, asserting that loyalty was not a performance but a sustained attention. The rebels heard, and some felt the shame of attention misapplied, while others were stirred by the dignity Enoch attached to small faithfulness. Enoch knew how to wear authority without coercion, and so he used questions as his principal tool. He did not demand confessions, he invited them to look at results. He asked what had happened to families where the children learned only the rhetoric of rebellion. He asked where songs go when their lyrics exalt only the singer. Questions opened mirrors in which the rebels found themselves reflected in ways they had not expected. These moments of reflection were dangerous and necessary. Dangerous because self-knowledge can shatter, necessary because without it there could be no true turning. He also warned them plainly about the cost of persistence and lawlessness. He did not embellish doom with relish. He described consequence as an inevitable chain reaction, like a tree toppling when the root is cut. He spoke of societies fraying, of trust dissolving into suspicion, of creations once intended for delight becoming instruments of fear. His warnings were not threats but honest reckonings, and because they were given with sorrow rather than triumph, they could be heard without the defensive armor of scorn. Some rebels hardened, others listened as if to the weather report before a storm, assessing whether to stay or to seek shelter. Enoch's message was never merely about blame. He countered accusation with the language of intercession, both a theological term and a human posture, the act of standing between harm and one who would not otherwise be spared. He told them that intercession is a skill, a disposition that learns to feel another's pains as if they were one's own. That disposition, he argued, was the antidote to defiance. It made rebellion appear ugly because it brought into view the faces harmed by it. Confronted with that image, some rebels slid toward regret, the slow and sincere kind, which grows roots instead of merely washing over the surface. He related how, in the courts of heaven he had seen, petitions are never mere words tossed into an abyss but conversations that change the petitioner. He told of scrolls that glowed with the effort of someone who had labored to remember names, to keep lament for the forgotten, to list hurts and hold them like precious things not to be tossed aside. The act of recording became itself a form of reverence. It affirmed that each pain, each plea, mattered. Enoch used this to teach the rebels that repentance is not merely a script but a reorientation of attention that registers and names what was wounded. He was candid about wonder as well. He marveled at acts of reconciliation he had encountered, small restorations that shone like coin placed back into circulation. He narrated scenes of people returning tools, of apology given without condition, of the lonely being invited to table. Such stories were his insistence that the world has a resilience, a capacity for mending if only the pattern of mutual rightness is rejoined. The rebels could not easily dismiss these examples without feeling the pull of their own unplayed part in restoration. Enoch's voice here was quieter, but its pressure was precise. It turned longing into a feasible path. He recounted a series of dialogues he had overheard among angels, conversations that sounded less like divine tribunal and more like concerned friends. They too worried about what the rebels' choices would cause, but their worry was wed to hope, to the belief that even those who stumble might be led back. Enoch used their tones to model the possibility of speaking with firm love, of refusing both indulgence and needless harshness. By doing so he crafted a language for how heaven itself regarded waywardness, as a problem to be solved, not a trophy to be displayed. The rebels were shown that even in heaven there was room for strategies of persuasion rather than only proclamations of vengeance. There were moments when he allowed the rebels to speak, to air the reasons for their dissent. It was part of his method to listen. He believed that understanding motive could unbind motive. Some confessed envy, a naked wanting that had grown teeth. Others described a hunger for novelty, a craving to make new devices and pronounce them law. Enoch did not excuse these things, but he turned them over like a careful artisan, showing how each impulse could be redirected toward craftsmanship that served the common good. In making space for their voices, he nurtured the fragile possibility that they might be reshaped rather than merely shamed. When he spoke of the future, Enoch did so with a craftsman's eye for detail and a prophet's patience for time. He painted futures not as single certainties but as branching roads, each contingent on choices made now. He described a world where the rebels' talents, if reconciled, became engines of repair, cities rebuilt with compassion, stars named not in arrogance but in reverent memory, laws made to free rather than to bind. He also painted the alternative in equal clarity, a world of circulating harms, of broken cycles and children taught only the ways of fracture. The clarity of his visions was designed to make decision unavoidable, better to choose in light than to drift in fog. He softened his language when he touched on mercy, because mercy is a practice, not a slogan. He told of moments when mercy had been extended to those who least expected it, and how those moments had created converts of the heart. Mercy, in his telling, was not the negation of justice but the skilled application of justice to restore life. He spoke of thresholds where mercy and firmness meet, explaining how both were necessary to stop the repetition of harm. The rebels were forced to reckon with the distinction between weakness and wisdom, and that reckoning unsettled their certainties. A turning point in his address was when he revealed the cost Enoch himself had borne as an intercessor. He did not make himself a martyr for spectacle, he simply narrated nights of fasting and days of pleading, the physical wear that comes from bearing the weight of other people's futures. He drew a picture of companionship in prayer, of hands joined across chasms, of petitions offered until new inclinations took root. He wanted them to see that mercy and intercession demand sacrifice, not of identity, but of simpler comforts, and that such sacrifice often births creativity rather than mere loss. For some rebels, this confession sounded like an invitation to enlist in a different kind of battle, one where the weapons were long patience and honest labor. Enoch also spoke of the community that forms around those who practice restoration. He described networks of repairers who shared resources, who taught apprentices how to heal houses and hearts alike. He made the rebels imagine the small economies of kindness that sustain a society, a baker remembering a neighbor's taste, a teacher staying late to tutor a child, a leader who retracts a harmful decree when faced with its consequences. These were not idealized scenes but lived patterns Enoch had seen. For the rebels who valued autonomy, he framed this as multiplication of freedom rather than its suppression. To be free is also to be responsible for the freedoms of others. He used metaphors drawn from craftsmanship with care, because the rebels admired skill. He compared repentance to the painstaking restoration of a cracked vessel, where each hairline fracture had to be cleaned and sealed before the true beauty of the vessel could return. The work, he said, was not merely cosmetic, it required understanding the stress lines, the history of pressure that produced cracks, and a willingness to reconstruct rather than discard. This image resonated with some rebels who had devoted themselves to forms and skills. They could see honor in repair. For others, it was an unwelcome reminder that creation was not an endless canvas for new signatures. He invoked the moral imagination, the human capacity to picture futures and thus be guided by them. He urged the rebels to try on alternate histories in their minds, to walk in the shoes of those they had harmed. He described how empathy, exercised deliberately, can become a muscle that changes one's very perspective, that can make a rebel see their own reflection in the faces of the vulnerable. Empathy, when cultivated, reframed self-interest. It became not the pursuit of personal gain but the stewardship of shared life. This was Enoch's strategic insistence that inner transformation is the wellspring of social transformation. He confronted the seductive philosophy that had woven through the rebels' reasoning, the belief that might makes right, that visibility equates to virtue, that novelty trumps continuity. He dissected these ideas with the gentle precision of an educator, not to belittle those who had been carried by them, but to show the logical holes and ethical consequences that followed. He illustrated how societies built on transient applause decay faster than those sustained by quiet covenants. With every example he offered, he tried to make the rebels see that longevity depends not on spectacle but on repeated acts of fidelity. Enoch's rhetoric was never merely intellectual, he embodied the practices he preached. He demonstrated patience before impatient listeners, paused to name fears, and allowed silences to cultivate honesty. His presence itself became a lesson in the power of steady affection to coax the heart. He also let his voice be laced with anger at injustice, so that his steadiness would not be mistaken for complacency. By balancing tenderness with righteous concern, he modeled a whole posture, one that remains tender without being permissive, firm without becoming cruel. He spoke often of responsibility as inheritance. Inheritance, he argued, is not only the receipt of goods but the receipt of obligations, names to remember, practices to continue, promises to honor. He used familial language because rebels often answered to kinship metaphors. You cannot reject a house you were raised in without losing an arm of belonging. To treat inheritance solely as right without duty, he argued, severs one from the continuity that grants meaning to gifts. For those who had sought freedom from constraints, inheritance became instead an invitation to a stewardship that dignified freedom with purpose. There were moments of poetic lyricism when Enoch allowed himself to speak as one who had been moved in the depths. He described the inner landscapes of repentance, valleys of humility, peaks of re-embodied joy, rivers of restored trust that sounded like song. The rebels were not immune to these images. Some were softened by the beauty of what restoration might look and feel like. Beauty, he suggested, is not merely an ornament but a signpost for good choices. It indicates what is worth protecting. In that sense, Enoch's language of beauty functioned as a practical ally in his persuasion. He took time to call out simony of spirit, the practice of selling one's conscience to the highest applause, and he did it without theatricality. He asked the rebels to consider who profits when conscience is traded for acclaim: the crowd, the voice that shouts the loudest, the person who momentarily benefits. But he also invited them to consider who loses: the tender ties, the long-term trust that cannot be purchased. Enoch's insistence was that integrity is not a commodity, it is what stabilizes relationships and societies alike. This insistence struck some as unglamorous, and yet gradually it calmed certain restless yearnings for spectacle. He spoke of time as a teacher with both patience and exactness. He told them that time will show the fruit of choices, sometimes in a season close at hand, often after a lifetime. Choices set vectors into motion, and those vectors, over the sweep of years, make either a ruin or a tapestry. Enoch wanted the rebels to think like gardeners and builders, not like men selling souvenirs on a fleeting marketplace. Time, when thought of as a moral factor, reframed impulsivity into long-term responsibility. He did not underestimate the difficulty of turning back. Repentance, he acknowledged, is painful precisely because it involves loss, the loss of an identity that had been built around certain choices. He honored this loss, admitting that it is human to grieve the collapse of long-held ways of understanding oneself. But he also paired that grief with the announcement of gain, the slow accrual of trust, the opening of new relational economies, the return of peace that feels like a regained limb. By acknowledging both sides, Enoch made repentance credible rather than coercive. Enoch told of small rites that help anchor people in the path of restoration, a public admission of wrong, a restitution where possible, a vow to live differently, and the practical acts that follow vows. He insisted these were not rote acts but practical disciplines that change behavior and thus character. The rituals he recommended were humble, returning a borrowed item, teaching what had been hoarded, stepping aside when power had been used unjustly. Through these practices, he argued, the rebels could produce evidence of a new disposition that might slowly convince former critics. He made space for dissenting voices among the rebels and treated them with respect. When they argued that power could be used to accelerate goodness, he countered not by dismissing the impulse but by shaping it. He asked them to imagine power married to accountability, to imagine authority that takes the form of servant leadership. This modeling took the sting out of their critique and redirected their zeal toward constructiveness. He showed that passion could be a fuel for repair if it were harnessed by practices that bind it to communal flourishing. He drew heavily on narrative because stories pierce argument where logic alone cannot. He recounted tales of rulers who turned from pride and discovered the relief of being forgiven, of scientists who redirected their gifts to heal rather than to dominate, of artists who reclaimed beauty from exploitation. These stories were not anecdotes, they were living proofs that transformation happens in ordinary lives. The rebels, some of whom were artists and thinkers, found in these stories a mirror to their own potentials. He spoke to the children as well as the elders, because Enoch knew that cultures are reared in the small habits taught to the young. He urged the rebels to consider what they would teach the next generation, cynicism or courage, a taste for spectacle or a taste for steadiness. He painted a future classroom where a child learns to ask, who benefits, before acting, and a kitchen where family remembers the debt owed to those who worked unnoticed. These scenes were not sentimental but tactical. To change a culture, one must change what it habitually reproduces. This practical vision appealed to the rebels who cared for legacy. He also addressed the question of accountability structures without getting lost in bureaucracy. He suggested simple mechanisms, independent witnesses, transparent records, restitution procedures. These were not to be traps but scaffolding, clear boundaries to prevent the repetition of harm. Enoch argued that structures of accountability are the outer skin of inner disciplines, and that both are necessary. The rebels, some of whom mistrusted any constraint, found in this a way to keep ambition from becoming predation without dissolving their capacity to innovate. Enoch did not shy away from lamenting the economic dimensions of rebellion, the ways greed reshapes markets and institutions. He described markets as moral terrains where incentives either encourage repair or reward exploitation. He asked the rebels whether their designs could be redirected to create systems where thrift was aligned with generosity, where success bore responsibility. He presented models not as prescriptions but as prototypes to be tested and improved. For those whose rebellion had been motivated by economic advantage, these models were a challenge and an opportunity both. He used the language of covenant repeatedly, because covenant is both relational and legal in texture. Covenant ties people into lasting obligations, and Enoch wanted the rebels to experience lesser bonds as meaningful. He contended that covenant produces a horizon on which judgments hang and mercy can play. To accept covenant is to accept limitation, but it is also to accept identity, history, and the cushioning of community in times of failure. This argument framed limitation as dignity rather than diminution. He spoke of beauty again toward the end of many conversations because beauty provides hope when explanation wanes. He described a future where wounds were visible but tended, where scars marked not only pain but survival. He insisted that beauty is not a luxury reserved for the victorious, it is a feature of worlds that have learned to heal. This insistence rekindled in some rebels the idea that their skills might one day contribute to something that lasts beyond their own lifetimes. Enoch was realistic about resistance. He knew that some would cling to defiance because it felt like control. He did not vilify those who resisted but attempted to move them by showing the long selfishness of short-sighted power. He invited them to test their strength in the more difficult enterprise of resisting the urge to dominate and instead serving with excellence. In that reframing, power became not an end but a discipline, a practice of ordering life toward common flourishing. His tone was not only moral but practical. He taught techniques for rebuilding trust in personal relationships and institutions and public spaces. He described the slow work of proving reliability, keeping small promises, making reparations promptly, building predictability into governance. By focusing on the concrete, he gave the rebels a map for action rather than a mere moral scolding. They were, after all, makers and actors. Giving them a path to do what they once did well but differently was a persuasive strategy. Enoch's teachings were punctuated by silence at times, because silence invites self-confrontation. He allowed the rebels to sit with their choices, to feel the weight of what had been done without the pressure of immediate resolution. Those silences functioned like a patient counselor's pause, allowing confession and resolve to rise authentically rather than be produced for effect. In those waiting rooms of reflection, shifts often began unseen but real. He used ritual language sparingly but deliberately, because ritual converts an idea into embodied memory. He proposed simple rites of reconciliation, a shared meal with the wronged party, public recounting of harms, a day of repair where communities take on projects to mend what was broken. Ritual turns intention into repeated action, and repetition is the teacher of habit. By translating values into rites, Enoch offered a way to make the rebels' new commitments visible and communal. He offered to stand with them in the early phases of turning, an example of mutual accountability rather than a solitary prophet perched on a scaffold. He promised to visit and to listen, to remember names and to keep them, and to use the authority he held to protect those who sought repair. His intercession was not a magical erasure of consequence, but a companion through the task of restitution. This offer of accompaniment removed an important obstacle: no one repents well alone. There were, Enoch admitted, moments when his entreaties failed to persuade. He did not dramatize those failures, he cataloged them as part of the terrain. He described how some rebels hardened, doubling down on choices that further fragmented life. Yet even in this sober account, he refused to consign anyone to finality. He kept reserves of hope, not naive but strategically patient. His hope was a steady fire kept banked, ready for any who would approach with sincerity. As seasons turned in his narratives, Enoch described small conversions that looked unremarkable at first but grew into profound changes. A rebel who once ridiculed institutions became their quiet steward. Another who prized spectacle became an artisan of humble craft. These transformations were slow and often incomplete, yet they were real, and Enoch celebrated them as evidence of what persistent intercession can produce. Change, he insisted, is more like slow gardening than explosive revolution. He urged the rebels to learn the ancient arts of lament and gratitude together, because grief without gratitude hardens into bitterness, and gratitude without grief can become complacent. He taught them to hold both, mourning for what was broken and thanks for what remains or returns. These twin disciplines create a balance that prevents either cynicism or naive celebration. Enoch's insistence on holding both made his message nuanced, neither simplistic nor sentimental. Toward the close of many meetings, he reminded them that the cosmos itself had order, and that human choices resonate beyond human communities. He used the metaphor of a loom: pull one thread too harshly and the pattern puckers, altering images far from the tug. This image helped rebels see their acts as more than personal theater. They are moves in a larger pattern whose consequences radiate. The metaphor carried a moral gravity that was not melodramatic but simply true in its logic. He left them with tasks, not tests, small, reasonable practices to begin the movement back toward communal life. Return what you took, he said. Speak truth and then keep your word. Invite those you've shunned into conversation, and let them name their wounds. These tasks were not presented as boxes to be ticked for approval, but as scaffolding for genuine reorientation. They were designed to be doable and thus to create positive feedback loops that nurture further fidelity. Finally, Enoch's message held an open-ended invitation rather than a closed verdict. He did not demand instant transformation, he asked for a first step. His style of intercession respected the rebels' agency even as it insisted upon responsibility. The invitation was compelling because it honored freedom while reassigning it to a place where freedom could be sustained by justice and love. In that gentle but unyielding way, Enoch stood between ruin and repair, an intercessor whose most radical act was to keep hope practical and workaday. There is a moment in the oldest stories when the world seems breathless and the sky leans in to listen, and in that hush a man named Enoch walks between two worlds as if across a narrow bridge. The air around him hums with an authority that is not merely loud but precise, the kind of clarity that belongs to justice rather than force. He does not shout, he lays out reason and righteousness as if they were stones, fitting them together so the path holds. You can almost feel your own steps finding purchase when you imagine walking behind him, watching how his words make the clouds sharpen into law. Enoch's reputation as intercessor comes from more than piety. It comes from a peculiar insistence that mercy must answer to truth. He stands in the gap, they say, not to smother judgment but to make it fair. The intercessor is sometimes pictured as a shield, and yet Enoch is neither passive nor merely defensive. He is active, precise, like a sculptor who removes the false shape to reveal the right one underneath, and every movement matters. Listen closely and you hear justice as a kind of music in Enoch's story, a rhythm of claims and counterclaims and the steady beat of accountability. Justice demands names, and Enoch speaks them. He names offenses against creation and the breaches in the covenant between heaven and earth, but he also names wounds so that healing can be addressed. The act of naming is not small, it is the first act of ordering a chaotic world into a world that can be made right. Justice in Enoch's hands is not a cold ledger balanced with iron and salt. It is both fierce and tender. He knows the exact weight of a human sorrow and the precise measure of a cosmic wrong, and he brings both before the throne with a voice that balances plea and principle. Imagine a courtroom where the judge is relentless for truth yet listens as if he will change the course of the case based on what is revealed. Enoch sits in that place, not to remove judgment but to shape its fairness. There is something old and deep about his intercession, as if it follows a law older than any city or king. He appeals to a higher form of balance that predates human law, a moral ledger written in the bones of the world. When he speaks, the mountains stop grinding against one another and the seas hush. Even the winds seem to lean in to hear whether the plea will persuade. His pleading is not a plea for elimination of consequence, but for the restoration of order that honors both justice and mercy. The texts and tales that preserve Enoch's figure vary in tone and temperament, but they converge at a single point. He disappears from ordinary history into a place where justice is raw and direct. This disappearance is not absence but transformation. To be taken up in that context is to be appointed as an intermediary, a mediator who conducts the movement between accusation and absolution. He becomes an interpreter of cosmic statutes and the voice by which the heavens negotiate with the earth. Enoch's justice is prosecutorial, but it is also pastoral. He can indict without delight and console without compromise. He understands that wrongdoing is often a symptom of larger disorder, and so his intercession aims at roots as much as at fruits. When he confronts the guilty, he does so not to taste their fall, but to expose the rot so it can be excised and the tree might stand again. In the long nights of allegory, Enoch sits at the edge of the fire where the questions burn hottest. He listens to the complaints of the oppressed and the rationalizations of the powerful, and he parses each with unerring attention. This is not impartiality for its own sake, it is the discipline of attending to particulars. Justice, in this sense, is patient in the particulars and swift in the recognition of patterns that must be broken. You might imagine Enoch as a traveler who has crossed deserts of despair and oceans of indifference. He returns with the map of what he has seen, and he lays it before the courts of angels and men alike. He points to the places where the moral compass spins and insists that each compass be recalibrated. His authority is not raw power, but accumulated knowledge of how wrongs multiply when unaddressed. There is a striking scene that recurs in the traditions, Enoch standing before a council of celestial beings, and the air around them is like pressed paper, ready to accept the ink of justice. He lays out before them the catalogue of human brokenness and celestial transgression alike. It is a risky act, because to call out the divine or semi-divine is to risk wrath from above as much as from below. But his courage is matched by his conviction that justice cannot be partial simply because its enemies are powerful. In that portrayal, his intercession performs two tasks at once: it indicts the corrupt and it instructs the righteous. He is not only a petitioner but a teacher. Those who listen learn how to see wrong and how to respond to it. Even when his words cut, they also illuminate a way forward, as if the judgment itself carries within it the seed of reform. Enoch's justice is particularly concerned with the consequences of neglect. He names how small neglects compound into catastrophe and how silence, left unchallenged, grows like mold over the moral architecture of society. He knows that justice delayed becomes injustice, and so he has little patience for evasions that create further victims. To him, an unspoken wrong is not merely dormant, it is an active force eating at the community. At the heart of Enoch's intercession is a theology of accountability that refuses to allow the powerful to hide behind an aura of mystery. He insists that authority must answer to ethics. When kings or spirits claim exemption, he lays bare the obligations that come with their status. His hand points to the ledger that even crowns and thrones cannot ignore, a ledger written in the bones of those who have been harmed. And yet he is not simply a harbinger of dread. When he stands before the divine and argues for mercy, he argues with all the precision of someone who knows the economy of grace. He measures mitigation and restoration with equal seriousness. Forgiveness for him is not a cheap pardon but a costly repair. His petitions ask that those who have damaged be restored and that the costs of repair be met in ways that do not shift the burden onto the innocents. Enoch's language is often stern because injustice itself is stern. But his sternness is not an absence of beauty, it is beauty turned toward the exacting requirement of the good. He speaks in parables sharp as knives, yet those knives cut away only the dead tissue. Listeners who journey with him learn that the dignity of justice is its refusal to let harm become ordinary. Consider the image of balance that follows him, scales that do not merely weigh actions but weigh consequences, intentions, and social contexts. He knows that an act cannot be understood solely by its outer motion, motives and circumstances matter. This complicates simple retribution, and Enoch welcomes that complexity, because justice that ignores nuance is only cruelty with confirmation. There are times when Enoch's intercession looks like lawmaking. He interprets and refines the statutes of the community so that they protect the weak and bind the powerful. At other times it looks like prophetic denunciation, calling sin by its harshest name until the entire social fabric shudders awake. The dual nature of his role, legal and prophetic, makes him indispensable in the stories where societies are at risk of losing their moral compass. He does not, however, love the sound of his own voice. Enoch's greatest power is silence, the silence that follows a question too honest to be answered with a lie. When he stands between accuser and accused, he knows that the pause itself can reveal more truth than any speech. People unraveled under that silence because it required them to answer themselves, and often their own conscience could not find a defense. This intercessory silence becomes a tool of justice. It is the moment when the guilty realize that they must account for their deeds, and it is the moment when the innocent can be heard without the noise of false testimony. Enoch uses it to create conditions for confession and reparation, believing that truth is the ground upon which justice stands. Silence, in his hands, is disciplined and purposeful, not evasive. There are ancient scenes where Enoch walks among cities and his shadow alters the behavior of those who pass beneath it, not because of magic but because justice has a way of changing the air. People bend toward honesty as if toward a light they had forgotten. Thieves suddenly see the faces of those they have harmed. It is as if his presence reorients the moral magnetic field of the place. And he is not naive about human capacity for deceit. He knows that some will try to wear his name as a cloak, to mimic the language of righteousness while keeping the heart of selfishness. He calls out such hypocrisy with a surgical accuracy that leaves no room for the theater of virtue. For Enoch, justice includes exposing the performance, because false virtue corrodes the social bond more than overt vice does. Enoch's relationship to the divine court is complicated and instructive. He appeals to a justice that is both immanent and transcendent, a standard that neither human law nor celestial edict can fully encompass without reference to love. He insists that divine justice cannot be divorced from compassion, and yet he refuses to soften the claims of truth. This tension drives much of his intercession and makes his approach both demanding and hopeful. When he petitions on behalf of the earth and its creatures, his justice widens to include non-human goods. He speaks for groves and rivers as if they had voices, bringing charges against those who defile the natural order. In his view, justice must account for the web of life, because harms to animals and land rebound on human communities. His advocacy anticipates ideas about stewardship and responsibility that will be argued for centuries later. The vision of Enoch ascending, as told and retold, is a vision of someone who moves beyond mere human advocacy into a cosmic role. He encounters beings who have their own forms of corruption, offspring of heaven who abandon their posts, and angelic judges who bend rules to favor kin. He holds them to the same standard he applies on earth, reminding heavens that power without accountability becomes tyranny even in the most luminous realms. Such scenes are striking because they erase the easy division between sacred and profane misdeeds. Enoch shows that injustice is not a human monopoly, it is a universal threat. Therefore, intercession must be universal too. He pleads with angels to answer for their failures and asks heaven itself to be both judge and remedy for what it has allowed to flourish. Enoch's justice is notable for its insistence on proportionality. He argues against revenge that exceeds the crime, against penalties that do not fit the harm. When he faces calls for annihilation, he proposes restraint and measured correction. This is not sentimentality but a clear-eyed belief that punishment that destroys more than it repairs perpetuates the very injustice it claims to correct. In the narratives, Enoch often negotiates what one might call restorative frameworks before punitive ones. He envisions reparations that include reconciliation, restitution, and transformation. Those who have wronged are given pathways to make amends, not to escape consequence but to undertake the labor of repair. Such a kind of justice refocuses the moral energy of communities from vengeance to restoration. But Enoch does not promise easy reforms. He knows that some transgressions are so severe that they demand severe terms. His intercession never minimizes evil, it seeks its true measurement. When he speaks for mercy, he does so with a full awareness of the depth of the wound, insisting that any remedy must be adequate to the damage done. It is this refusal to sentimentalize suffering that gives Enoch's mercy its credibility. He will not silver the scales to make forgiveness palatable. He brings the instruments of justice and shows how mercy can be enacted without ignoring harm. To listeners, this feels honest. You can trust an intercessor who names the hurt before offering balm. The argumentative style of Enoch is sometimes legal, sometimes liturgical. He arranges his pleas with the care of a lawyer and the cadence of a priest. This mixture makes his speech effective in courts of law and in places of worship, because it addresses both the mind and the soul. People who hear him feel both challenged and consoled, a rare combination when justice is at stake. There is a moral clarity to his metaphors. He often speaks of light and shadow to describe conscience and guilt, but he adds texture. Shadows are not mere darkness, but where things are hidden that must be brought into light. Light itself, he suggests, is not neutral, it is the environment in which things can be healed. Justice is then the act of adjusting illumination so that healing becomes possible. Enoch's intercession takes on social dimensions as well. He challenges systems, economic, political, and religious, that perpetuate inequality. He maps how regulations and rituals can be perverted to protect the few and impoverish the many, and he demands redesign. His proposals are practical and prophetic. He reshapes institutions so that they safeguard dignity rather than exploit it. He is also attuned to the small violences that become normalized, a slur said in passing, a gesture of contempt, a law that quietly buries the poorest. He catalogs these discrete harms and shows how they contribute to a climate of injustice. For Enoch, justice is as much about uprooting daily cruelties as it is about adjudicating grand crimes. Yet there is a tenderness in his attention to individuals. When a single mother bends under the weight of scarcity, Enoch does not treat her as a statistic. He is exact about the particulars of her pain and refuses policies that paper over her suffering with abstractions. His eye is on faces and hands and the small acts of kindness that become the mortar of social life. The intercessory voice of Enoch often appeals to memory. He invokes names, events, and covenants to ground his arguments. Memory here is not nostalgic, it is evidentiary. He uses the past as a resource not to idealize but to hold current actors accountable to promises made and to lessons learned. There is also an eschatological edge to his justice. He does not imagine a final reconciliation without final accounting. For Enoch, the end time is not a sentimental reunion but a moment when all deceptions are stripped away and the true measure of every life is seen. His intercession is therefore urgent. It works to prepare the world for that appraisal by aligning daily structures with eternal standards. This urgency gives his work a moral intensity. The clock of accountability ticks in his ears, and he refuses to let comfort lull the community into inactivity. His warnings are often poetic but never mere flourish, they are strategic calls to reform. He insists that the practices of justice must be built now because the final reckoning will reward what has been done rather than what has been promised. Enoch's dialogues with the divine sometimes read like intimate arguments between family members who love each other too much to accept harm. He reproves with affection and petitions with firmness, framing the relationship with heavenly beings as one that requires mutual responsibility. This familial idiom transforms abstract metaphysics into a living moral economy. The image of Enoch interceding for sinners and also for the planet gives his justice a wide embrace. His care includes future generations who cannot speak for themselves, and he becomes their mouthpiece. He articulates obligations to those unborn, arguing that justice transcends immediate interests and includes stewardship of what will be inherited. Sometimes his intercession takes a juridical form, producing decrees and edicts that reshape the heavens' operations. These cosmic reforms are not autocratic, they are negotiated in the pressure of argument and persuasion. Enoch uses reason, precedent, and moral imagination to convince ancient powers to amend their ways. The scene is less drama than painstaking legislative work, and yet it is suffused with awe. You might be surprised to find humor in Enoch's justice, a dry wit that disarms pretension. He can expose absurdity with a single observation, and that lightness sometimes dislodges stubborn blindness. Humor in his repertoire is never cruelty, it is a clarifying instrument that reveals how ridiculous injustice looks when seen from a truer vantage point. As an intercessor, Enoch models endurance. He engages in long, often weary negotiations because justice rarely yields to a single plea. His persistence is not obstinacy, but fidelity to the work of correction. Listeners who follow him learn that sustaining justice requires patience over years and the ability to return to the field again and again. There is an artistry to how he frames blame and forgiveness together. He refuses the false dichotomy that asks us to choose between condemnation and mercy. Instead, he insists on a justice that makes space for both, a balance where reprimand and rehabilitation sit at opposite ends of a bridge and each must support the other. This integrated vision resists easy simplifications. Enoch's intercession often takes the form of real-world ethics, with concrete recommendations about restitution, community repair, and accountability. He suggests practices as well as principles: public confession, funded reparations, restructuring of legal procedures, and the creation of institutions dedicated to the vulnerable. These are not mere proposals but enacted practices in the stories, indicating his practical bent toward systemic change. He is also a teacher of repentance. His notion of turning is not merely regret but a turning of one's life toward reparation. Repentance in Enoch's vocabulary requires visible labor to make amends, not private sorrow disguised as public virtue. This makes repentance costly in the best sense. It requires sacrifice that benefits others. Ethical imagination is central to his work. Enoch helps communities imagine alternatives to cycles of vengeance. He narrates scenarios where those harmed are restored and those who harmed become agents of repair. His stories give shape to possible futures and thereby mobilize people to work toward them. At times, his intercession reads autobiographically. He confesses his own mistakes even as he pleads for others. This vulnerability grounds his authority. He does not pose as someone outside of fallibility. Instead, he models how one continues to intercede for justice amid personal imperfection. Enoch's presence in sacred memory is a corrective to triumphalism. When leaders boast of their achievements, his voice returns to remind them of moral debts. He deflates arrogance by pointing to neglected obligations, showing that true greatness is measured by fidelity to justice rather than accumulation of power. In the hush of the narrative, Enoch often reflects on the cost of calling truth to power. He knows that intercession might make him enemies and mark him as a dangerous man to those whose privileges are threatened. Yet he persists because he believes the cost is worth the preservation of communal life. His courage is thus rooted in an ethic that values the common good above personal safety. There is also an educational dimension to his intercession. He trains others in the art of just speech, teaching how to plead without manipulation, how to accuse without demonizing, and how to forgive without condoning. His pedagogical method is patient and rigorous, shaping future generations who will carry on the work of justice. Across traditions, Enoch becomes a symbol of a justice that is incarnational. It takes shape in real actions among real people rather than abstract diatribe. He insists that heaven's mercy must have earthly hands and that moral claims are validated by concrete change. This theology of embodied justice insists that belief matters only insofar as it transforms behavior. The tension between cosmic and civic justice is a constant theme. Enoch negotiates both with equal seriousness, arguing that the two cannot be separated without loss. He moves fluently from legal minutiae into cosmic philosophy, showing that a robust theory of justice must account for scales both small and vast. He is also an advocate for transparency, believing that shadows breed injustice. He calls for openness in governance, ritual, and private life when secrecy becomes a shelter for harm. This insistence on light is practical as well as ethical, because transparency makes it harder to hide systemic abuses. Yet he is sensitive to the limits of disclosure. Some secrets, like personal grief, must be respected. He distinguishes between protective privacy and secrecy used for exploitation. Justice, for Enoch, includes discernment in what is revealed and what is held sacred. The archival impulse in his thought is noteworthy. He records wrongs and repairs with meticulous detail, understanding that memory and record-keeping are foundational for accountability. In doing so, he transforms memory into a guarantor of justice, a storehouse from which later actors can draw evidence for repair. Enoch's sense of covenant is central. He sees justice as a feature of relationships bound by promise. Covenants create obligations that outlast any single generation, and he treats them as moral anchors. His intercession is often framed as reminding communities and heavens of their covenantal duties. When nations or cities fail to honor their promises, Enoch becomes a reminder of the temporal consequences. He speaks of patterns of ruin that follow covenantal neglect, and he proposes steps toward renewal. His rhetoric is both prophetic and programmatic, a blend of sharp critique and practical roadmap. The judicial patience he exhibits is instructive in an age of instant reaction. He is not a man of quick fixes but of long-term commitments. He builds institutions capable of carrying justice forward through generations, not just momentary displays of righteousness. This institutional imagination is part of his legacy. Throughout his intercession, Enoch moves between firmness and warmth. He can be uncompromising in principle and tender in relationship. This balance makes him an effective mediator because those he confronts rarely feel annihilated. They feel seen and challenged in ways that open them to reform. Enoch also uses narrative as a tool of justice. He tells stories that reveal the consequences of wrongdoing over time, giving listeners a sense of history's arc. These narratives are moral technologies. They shape perception and orient communities toward repair. Story, for him, becomes a way to teach ethical attention. Consider his use of metaphor again. He likens justice to a garden tended with care. Neglect leaves weeds to overrun crops and poison what might have been harvest. His horticultural imagery is practical. Pruning, watering, and composting are metaphors for correction, restoration, and conversion. There are moments in which Enoch's intercession becomes almost legal poetry. He articulates pleas with rhetorical precision and moral beauty. Listeners are drawn not only by argument but by the aesthetic force of his speech, which makes truth sound necessary as well as just. He is also an embodiment of humility and advocacy. Though powerful, he does not demand homage. He stands as an intermediary who lowers himself to the level of those he defends, adopting their language and their needs in order to be effective. This humility gives his justice moral gravitas. Enoch's voice has been invoked by reformers across epochs, but its essence remains centered on accountability that does not ignore mercy. He is a model for those who engage in hard conversations, showing that firmness and compassion need not be enemies. The interplay produces a robust ethic, one that listeners find both demanding and livable. When he contends with cosmic bureaucracy, he is not merely argumentative, he is imaginative in creating mechanisms of redress. He proposes judicial architectures and moral protocols that outlast individual actors. His designs often include checks and balances that aim to prevent future abuses, demonstrating foresight in his intercession. Yet his designs are not cold. They always include a space for redemption. Even in the systems he constructs, pathways to restoration are built in. This is why his justice is not vengeful but reparative, a mode that looks forward to communal flourishing rather than backward to retribution. In some portrayals, Enoch becomes a patron of mediation, someone to whom disputes are referred precisely because he can hold competing claims without capitulating to either. His presence stabilizes volatile situations because he is trusted to weigh both sides carefully. The trust he earns is not merely social, it is moral and earned through long practice. He is also attuned to the psychology of wrongdoing. He understands shame, denial, and rationalization, and he addresses them not with platitudes but with practices. He diagnoses the inner structures that sustain injustice and prescribes inner work alongside outer repair. His intercession thus becomes therapeutic as well as juridical. The narrative repeatedly emphasizes his fidelity to truth even when truth is unpopular. He insists that truth is not a matter of convenience and that justice must at times be uncomfortable. This insistence makes him a challenging figure for listeners, for it asks them to reassess their own complicities. Enoch's justice brings a critique of idolatries of success. He undermines the assumption that prosperity is the sole sign of divine favor and insists that integrity is the proper measure of blessing. This counters easy narratives that equate victory with virtue and invites a deeper examination of moral results. There is a constant ethical tension in his intercession between individual and collective responsibility. He holds both persons and systems accountable, arguing that neither can be absolved by the other. Individuals must answer for their deeds, and systems must be reformed so that personal wrongs are less likely to spread and persist. Enoch's advocacy also addresses the rhetoric of power. He does not allow eloquence to substitute for justice. He notices how flattery and persuasion can be weaponized to legitimize injustice, and he counters that with a rhetoric of candor. His plain speaking, paradoxically, often cuts through the fog of grandiloquence. In the quiet moments, Enoch reflects on suffering itself, not merely as a sign of wrongdoing but as a call to compassion. He elevates the voice of the wounded into the center of moral discourse and insists that laws must be judged by their effects on those at the margins. This moral prioritization reshapes priorities and policies. His intercession is also theological in method. He grounds his arguments in the character of the divine as just and compassionate. He claims that heavens are not arbitrary but bound by the nature of the good. This theological grounding provides normative weight to his appeals and frames justice as a reflection of the divine will rather than a human invention. Yet he is mindful of the limits of theology alone. He turns theology into practice by insisting on embodied reforms. Belief without transformation is empty in his reckoning, and he challenges religious communities to translate creed into concrete care. His insistence on praxis bridges the gap between theory and living justice. Enoch's life, as told, becomes a curriculum for those who wish to learn the art of intercession. His methods, attention, naming, patience, proportionality, imaginative foresight, and restorative frameworks, coalesce into a pedagogy for justice workers. If you listen to him, you learn not only to plead but to build the structures that sustain fairness. He is also acutely aware of the dangers of self-righteousness. He warns those who would judge without self-examination that their condemnation will rebound upon them. This admonition fosters humility among his followers and serves as a safeguard against the abuse of justice itself. Enoch's intercessory role is thus a continuous tension between holding fast and letting go where appropriate. He is demanding and merciful, an advocate who never allows compassion to become a cover for evading responsibility. His balance becomes a rule of thumb for those who mediate, firm in principle, tender in effect. In the end, though the stories take him into the heavens, his justice always has an ear tuned to earth. He measures outcomes by their capacity to create communities of mutual care. Heaven's decrees, in his care, must cascade down into policies that uplift neighborhoods, protect children, and heal the wounded. The figure of Enoch continues to speak because his work is unfinished. Justice is never a task that reaches a final resting place, it is a perpetual endeavor that must be tended. Enoch's intercession models how one life might be dedicated to that ongoing labor, showing that persistence, clarity, and moral imagination can reshape both human and celestial orders. So when you find yourself distracted by the day's errands, imagine Enoch standing in the hush between sentences and the pause between breaths of the world. Hear his insistence that justice is precise, that mercy must be accountable, and that intercession is work, arduous, faithful work that refuses to let wrongs calcify. His story invites you into a long conversation about how communities might be made whole, a conversation that, like justice, has no simple ending but requires unending care. This story of Enoch is a reminder that justice is built in small moments. Subscribe and write in the comments what stays with you more, his strength to act or his patience to keep believing.